Chapter 359. Give it to me. Huiyan stretched out his large hand until it reached in front of Lu Chen. Lu Chen looked left and right and saw that this place was indeed very far from the Black Fire tribe. Apart from the two of them, there was no one else around. He nodded and said, "Give me the fire god's staff." Huiyan pulled out the fire god's staff from a bag on his substitute body. Lu Chen looked at it and asked, "Have you been carrying it with you these days?" Huiyan lightly said, "This divine weapon is so important. How can I let it leave my hands? In the future, I will have to rely on it for my grand plans and even control of the tribe." He caressed the staff a few times and handed it over to Lu Chen. In that instant, he seemed to sigh and bitterly smiled. "But I also did not think that the only person in this world that I can hand over this staff without worry would be you, a human." Lu Chen gently took it and said, "If you are like this, you will be very sad in the future. I'm afraid it will be very difficult to find someone that you can completely trust." Huiyan coldly laughed and proudly said, "As long as I have the god's staff, I don't need anyone else." Lu Chen looked deeply at him and nodded. "Good. I hope that in a few decades, you will still be able to say this." As he spoke, he held one end of the fire god's staff and placed the other end next to Huiyan's large head. Then, he began to chant a strange incantation in a low voice. As his voice echoed, the runes on the fire god's staff lit up one by one. A strange black flame gently burned. At the same time, Huiyan suddenly frowned, as if he felt something. Then, he concentrated and listened, as if he was trying to memorize it. After a while, Lu Chen listened and said to Huiyan, "Have you memorized it?" The flame closed its eyes and was silent for a while. Then, it opened its eyes and nodded. Lu Chen waved his hand and the light shadow on the fire god's staff disappeared. Everything returned to its original state. He then returned the divine weapon to Huiyan and said, "Remember this in your heart. This technique can only borrow the power of the fire god's staff to control the hundreds of black fire guards that I have created with the runes, but it cannot create new people. In other words, if you want more black fire guards in the future, you can only rely on your priests to inscribe runes and control the priests to control more black fire guards. Even if this group of people is the most reliable and powerful force you have right now, it can be considered a gift from me before I leave." "Gift?" Huiyan muttered. "When we left the tribe's camp, I saw the expressions of the black fire guards. Many of them seemed to want to rush over and kill you." Lu Chen smiled and said, "They only dare to think about it. If one of them really rushed out, I'll take it that he has the guts." Huiyan looked at him and frowned. "Although you have given these people to me, but hearing you humiliate the warriors of the Brute tribe, I still feel unhappy." Lu Chen smiled and shook his head. "First, I will leave soon. I don't know if I will live or die. Why should I care about what you Brute tribe think? Second, those people who are cowardly but have no choice but to listen to orders and fight to the death, isn't that what you want? Isn't this kind of black fire guards more useful?" After he finished speaking, he laughed and patted Huiyan's shoulder. "Don't you think so?" Huiyan was silent for a long time. In the end, he laughed bitterly and said, "Scram." Walking into the depths of the wasteland, there was no one in front or behind them, only the wind blowing. Then, they also stopped. Lu Chen turned around and said, "Let's go." Huiyan nodded, but suddenly opened his mouth to stop him, saying, "Wait a moment." Lu Chen stopped and said, "What, is there something else?" Huiyan thought for a while and said, "Will we have the chance to meet again in the future?" Lu Chen thought for a while, then shook his head and said, "It should be impossible. This time, when I return north, if the path in the Great Snow Mountain is really as dangerous as you said, if my luck is not good, I'm afraid I won't be able to walk out and will die there. But if my luck is good, I think I won't come back." He turned his head to look at the surrounding scenery of the wasteland and said, "I don't like this place." Huiyan sighed and said, "What a pity, I really want you to stay, and sometimes I also think, after you leave, I probably won't have anyone to talk to so frankly in my life." Lu Chen was slightly surprised. He looked at him and said, "What, it sounds like you really want to have a friend to talk to." Hui Yan was silent for a moment before he burst into laughter. He waved his hand and said, "It's just a joke. In this wasteland, we barbarians only believe in strength. No friend can compare to this." As he spoke, he grabbed the fire god's staff and waved it in front of Lu Qin. Then he said proudly, "Just you wait. In the future, when I succeed, I will definitely think of a way to go north to visit your human territory. At that time, if we are fated to meet again, we will drink to our heart's content. Perhaps at that time, for your sake, I will be a bit merciful and kill a few of your people." "North?" Lu Qin smiled, then nodded and said, "That's ambitious. Good, I will wait for you. But your merciful heart, have you heard of the Bodhisattva of the divine central plains?" "Bodhisattva? What is that?" "Just a legendary merciful immortal. But forget it, you don't need to know. After all." Lu Qin turned around and strode forward. At the same time, he said, "After all, in your heart, there is no longer a god. Live a few more years." Hui Yan said with a laugh. "You too." There would always be parting in life, just like a banquet that would eventually end. But this trip to the southern border was like a fleeting dream, making it impossible for one to love it. Lu Qin and Atu walked away with big strides. Occasionally, they would turn their heads to look back, and they would see that the tall and sturdy barbarian was still standing in the wilderness. However, his figure was gradually becoming blurry. What would everyone be like in a few decades? How different would everyone's fate be? Or perhaps, these two people who were at opposite ends of the world, who should have been separated by a great distance and never intersected, might not even be able to live to that time. Who knew, Atsu? Lu Qin suddenly called out as he looked at the desolate scenery in front of him. Atsu raised its head and looked at him. Actually, it turned its head. This big black wolf had stayed in this wasteland for a year or two, and its body seemed to have grown even bigger. Just by standing, it seemed to be taller than Lu Qin. "Why don't you stay here?" Lu Qin said. Atsu's footsteps suddenly stopped. It looked stunned for a moment, and then it let out a low growl. It seemed to be very angry at Lu Qin's words, and it even bared its fangs. Lu Qin smiled and glanced at the scenery around him. He then said indifferently, "The method I used to save you in the past was actually a method that the devil cult had obtained from the barbarian tribes in the chaotic lands. If I remember correctly, based on your bloodline, you should belong to the holy beast that the barbarian tribe revered." He pointed to the south. The wasteland there was wider and more distant. The vast wind blew past, and the world was a vast expanse. Over there, in the south of the wasteland, is the place where the barbarian tribe lives. There are countless powerful and prosperous tribes living there, and it is far better than this barren north. There should be your kind there, and they are also the holy beasts that were born in this land. Do you want to go find them? After saying that, he stared at Atsu to see its reaction. He saw Atsu look to the south, and then it turned its head. It seemed to grumble at Lu Qin, and then it turned around and walked in the opposite direction. Lu Qin laughed, and chased after it, patted its head, and said with a smile, "Okay, then let's go together." With that, he exerted a little force in his hand, and his body rose into the air. He flipped over and sat on Atsu's back, and then said with a laugh, "Come on, let's go home." The giant black wolf looked up to the sky and howled. Its voice shook the wilderness, and then it rushed out like a black lightning, galloping across the vast and boundless wasteland. It ran faster and faster, and the more it ran, the more anxious it became, as if the earth was responding to it, as if its ancient bloodline had suddenly awakened on this day, and its blood was boiling. It galloped against the wind, rushing to the more distant mountains in the north, and behind the snow-covered peaks, to the hometown in its memory. Chapter 360. The Great Snowy Mountain was the tallest and largest mountain range in the vast land of chaos, spanning millions of miles. It was also one of the most difficult and dangerous places to cross since ancient times. This huge mountain range was windy and snowy all year round, and the weather was harsh. At the same time, there were many ferocious and powerful demonic beasts. For many years, no one had been able to pass through this barrier between the southern wilderness and the northern wilderness. However, in the hearts of the people from both the north and the south, this great snow mountain had a completely different meaning. The human race in the north regarded it as the most dangerous place in the world. They regarded it as the most dangerous place in the world. But, apart from that, they didn't have any other associations. But, among the barbarian tribes in the southern wilderness, they generally regarded this towering mountain range as a holy and lofty divine mountain. Many barbarians even believed that the god they believed in might live on the top of the great snow mountain. Lu Chen only learned of this difference after he came to the southern wilderness. After all, the northern and southern tribes had been separated by the land of chaos for thousands of years. Even if there were some surviving barbarian tribes in the land of chaos, it was basically impossible for them to have any contact with the human race. When they met, they would fight to the death. How could they have the leisure to exchange cultural views? And the road that Hui Yan told Lu Chen about to return to the north happened to be in this great snowy mountain. The great snowy mountain was windy and snowy all year round, and the weather was extremely harsh. Especially in the depths of the mountain range, the temperature plummeted. Not to mention that ordinary people could not survive here, even cultivators with cultivation would find it very difficult to survive here. Not to mention that the great snowy mountain was filled with tyrannical demonic beasts whose strength far exceeded that of the outside world. According to the legends of the human race, any demonic beast that had grown up in the great snowy mountain was almost as strong as a human Yuanying stage enlightened master. Moreover, it was said that in the deepest parts of the great snowy mountain, there were a few ancient species that had been left behind from ancient times. They had long been extinct in the outside world, and only survived in the great snowy mountain. Such a king of demonic beasts was extremely powerful. It was said that they were not weaker than a human deity stage enlightened master, or even stronger. It was precisely because such terrifying demon beasts resided here that no one dared to explore the depths of the demon beasts since ancient times until now. There were always a few brave people who were brave enough to venture into the demon beasts, but none of them returned. It was reasonable to say that it was impossible to pass through such a dangerous place. However, the secret that Hui Yan revealed to Lu Chen that day gave him a glimmer of hope. First of all, there were 3 days in a year where the wind and snow would stop. Second, that valley was obviously connected to the north and south. Otherwise, there was no way to explain what Hui Yan had said about seeing a demonic beast holding a human corpse in its mouth. Lu Chen had thought about this trip for a long time, but in the end, he still decided to take a gamble. Even though there were people and there were people, Lu Chen of people, the snowy of snowy mountain, they were mountain. As for the way back, Lu Chen didn't really have much of a choice, even though the snowy mountains were extremely dangerous. When he fell into the Longchuan, he encountered an extremely terrifying beast and was forced to hide in the mysterious seed. Then, he was washed away by the Longchuan River to the southern wilderness. However, if he wanted to go back, this path was obviously not possible. Because the river flowed all the way into the Chaos Abyss, an even more terrifying place. Lu Chen did not think that he had the ability to survive in that terrifying place. Going upstream was also not reliable. He had gone to check and found that the upper reaches of the Longchuan River were extremely wide. He could not even see the edge of the other side. It was not like a river, but more like a vast ocean. If he wanted to go there, he had to cross the Longchuan River. However, he had already experienced the dangers of the river once. No matter what, whether it was him or Atsu, he did not want to fall into the river a second time. At least when he was walking on land, he could still have some reaction and think of a way. He was not completely helpless in the water. In the end, he could only hide in the seed and face the situation where he knew nothing about the outside world and came out with the idea of leaving his life to fate. And to be honest, don't you think it's strange? Lu Chen used his hands to block the wind and snow in front of him. He lowered his body even more, almost sticking to the back of Hei Lang Atsu. At the same time, he muttered. At this moment, his whole body was lying on the back of Atsu. Compared to a human like him, Hei Lang Atsu was much more adapted to the environment of the great snowy mountain. Climbing mountains and wading rivers, braving the wind and snow, no matter how rugged the mountain road was, Atsu walked almost like it was walking on flat ground. It was unusually easy. This made Lu Chen, who was originally very worried, overjoyed. He could not help but sigh that raising such a lazy dog for so many years was really not a waste. As the saying goes, raising a dog for many years is to use it for a moment. However, as they gradually went deeper into the great snowy mountain, the wind and snow became stronger, and the mountain road became more rugged and dangerous. Even though Atsu was a monster that had already advanced, it gradually began to become a little difficult to walk. But in general, they were still much more relaxed than ordinary people. At least according to the instructions given by Hui Yan before they separated, this place was not too far from the secret canyon that he mentioned. Struggling to move forward in the howling and whistling wind and snow, Atsu's black fur seemed to have almost been dyed white. Even the huge dog's head had a lot of snow on it. Its 2 ears moved a little, and it turned back to look at Lu Chen. There was some unfriendly emotion in its eyes, probably contempt. Lu Chen did not care about it, and only said to himself, "Look, the great snowy mountain is windy and snowy, and it is bitterly cold all year round. It is obviously the most difficult place to live, but why are there so many powerful monsters gathered here?" Atsu's footsteps paused slightly, and then it once again barked unhappily, as if to say, "This dog is in a hurry, I don't have time to think so much." Lu Chen, on the other hand, raised his head, and looked through the wind and snow at the majestic mountain in the distance. He could not even see the peak of the mountain, and said to himself, "There must be something strange about this place." Ever since they entered the great snowy mountain, they had, of course, encountered many monsters along the way, but they, a man and a dog, managed to deal with them one by one. Atsu itself was a powerful monster, and when monsters that were weaker than it approached, most of them would be scared away. There were a few monsters that were not weaker than it, and some were even stronger than it, but either Lu Chen would help them, or they would use all kinds of strange methods to defeat those monsters, or if even he could not deal with them, they would simply run away. In short, their experience along the way was that monsters that were weaker than them naturally could not defeat them, and monsters that were stronger than them could not outrun Atsu. Therefore, they stumbled along the way, but unexpectedly, they entered the depths of the great snowy mountain safely. However, although everything seemed to be going very smoothly, Lu Chen was still a little worried in his heart. That was, they should not have encountered the most powerful and terrifying monsters in the legends. No one knew where the prehistoric monsters, which were said to be as powerful as deity transformation stage perfected monarchs, were hiding in the great snowy mountain. Of course, if they could avoid meeting such terrifying monsters, of course, it would be better not to. At least for now, it seemed that Lu Chen and Atsu were quite lucky. In the evening of this day, they finally found the canyon hidden in the depths of the great snowy mountain. No one knew how long it had been since anyone came here. The open space on the periphery of the canyon was already piled up with almost waist-high snow, which made it particularly difficult for Atsu and Lu Chen to walk. However, compared to what they saw when they stuck their heads out to look into the canyon, it was as beautiful as heaven. It was a bottomless valley. Perhaps there was a strange change in the earth veins many years ago, which created such a strange place in the depths of the great snowy mountain. Below the canyon was a huge bottomless crack. It was pitch black, and no one knew where it led to. Only the whistling and swirling wind and snow covered most of the huge crack in the ground. On both sides of the canyon were precipices that were tens of thousands of feet high, and it was difficult for apes and monkeys to climb. Only on one side of the precipice, as if it was the work of the gods, there was a natural precipice that was less than 2 feet wide, and some of the narrowest parts were less than 1 foot wide. The wind and snow were whistling, and behind the wind and snow, there seemed to be endless darkness. Lu Chen and Atsu stood there for a long time without saying anything. After a while, Lu Chen let out a long sigh and said, "Let's take a rest and wait for the wind and snow to stop." Chapter 361. The snowstorm in the Great Snowy Mountain was extremely strong, and it was difficult for ordinary people to stand. But in the canyon, perhaps because of the terrain, the strong wind blew down, carrying with it countless snowstorms, violently bombarding the hard stone walls on both sides. The power of the snowstorm was at least several times stronger than outside the canyon. Under such circumstances, walking on the less than 2 feet wide path was not much different from courting death. Lu Chen quickly confirmed this fact, and judged that with his and Atsu's abilities, it was indeed impossible to resist the thousands of years of natural defense in this huge mountain. He then made a very logical judgment, and decided to wait for the only 3 sunny days of the year. As for which 3 days the snowstorm would stop, Hui Yan actually did not say clearly that day, but according to him, it should be around this season, at most no more than half a month. But even so, there was still a very difficult matter at hand, and that was, even if they were outside the canyon, the environment in the great snowy mountain was still unbearable. The weather was freezing, the wind and snow filled the sky. Even if Lu Chen had cultivation, it was impossible to wait here day and night. However, he had a simple and convenient way to deal with this extremely difficult and dangerous problem that most people might not be able to solve. Hide in the mysterious tree hole. He braved the wind and snow, bringing Atsu around the secret canyon, and finally found a leeward cliff. The wind and snow here were much weaker, exposing a piece of hard rock. Lu Chen carefully examined the surroundings, and after confirming that there were no traces of people or monsters nearby, he brought Atsu to hide here, and then directly escaped into the mysterious tree hole. Compared to the time when he fled from the Kunlun mountain to the disorienting land in a hurry, this time on his return to the north, Lu Chen had plenty of time to prepare. Therefore, in order to avoid a predicament like last time at the bottom of the Longchuan River, or in order to at least last longer in that situation, Lu Chen stuffed more food and water into the tree hole this time. In addition, he even made a crude hourglass in his spare time in the Black Fire tribe, in order to prevent being unaware of the passage of time in the outside world when he was trapped in the tree hole. Compared to the bitter cold weather of the great snowy mountain outside, hiding in the tree hole was of course much more comfortable, but at the same time, it was very boring. The place was only so big, there was nowhere to walk, and there was nothing to see. After a long time, it was indeed a little stuffy, but fortunately, both Lu Chen and Atsu had experienced such days before, so it was tolerable. About every 3 to 4 hours, Lu Chen would come out of the tree hole to check on the situation. Firstly, to see if the snowstorm had stopped, and secondly, to check if there were any unusual movements around the seeds. However, this canyon seemed to be a very remote place. Not to mention that there were no signs of humans, even the beasts didn't like to come here. They just stayed here like this, and nothing unexpected happened. They had been safe and sound all this time. The snowstorm stopped on the 7th day after Lu Chen arrived at the valley. On that day, when Lu Chen and Atsu came out of the tree hole, they saw that the original white in front of them had suddenly disappeared. The mountains were quiet, and the sky was clear, blue, and as clean as a sparkling blue crystal. Only, at the edge of the mountain peaks further away, they could still see the white snowstorm swirling. From the looks of it, it seemed that the sudden clearing up and the stopping of the snowstorm only existed in the inner part of the Great Snow Mountain. In the outer area, the wind and snow were still blowing. Even though Lu Chen was experienced and knowledgeable, it was the first time he had seen such a strange scene. He could not help but look at it a few more times, thinking that there were indeed many strange things in the Great Snow Mountain. In fact, along the way, he had also noticed many things. For example, the most dangerous and ferocious demonic beasts in this mountain. Although most of them were extremely dangerous and violent, and the mere sight of them was terrifying, Lu Chen and Atsu had discovered that the demonic beasts in this mountain seemed to have an invisible boundary. No matter how ferocious or how angry they were, once Lu Chen and Atsu left their boundary, these demonic beasts would immediately stop, and no matter what, they would not take even half a step past their boundary. Along the way, based on this discovery, Lu Chen and Atsu fled in panic, and avoided many fatal disasters. But what was the reason for this, Lu Chen still could not figure out. Just like what he could not understand, the environment of the Great Snowy Mountain was so harsh. Why were there so many powerful demon beasts that were reluctant to leave? Was it not better to go down the mountain to live in the southern wilderness? These things were probably hard to understand. Lu Chen thought about the strange things he had seen in the past few days. Then, he packed up his things and walked with Atsu to the entrance of the canyon. He looked inside. After the wind and snow stopped, the flying snow in the valley also disappeared, including the strong wind that was howling non-stop. The entire nameless valley looked dead silent, and with the dark bottomless crack below, it gave off a very gloomy feeling. Lu Chen frowned and looked around the canyon for a while. He then patted Atu's head and said, "What do you think? We're going in now. If you're going to regret it, this is your last chance." Atsu glanced at him, but did not respond. Lu Chen laughed heartily and strode forward, walking into the canyon. The valley was very narrow, and for safety's sake, they had to stick their whole body to the cliff, and in front of them was a bottomless abyss. This kind of feeling really made people nervous and afraid. If an ordinary person was in such a situation, they would not be able to bear the pressure after walking for a long time. Their hands and feet would tremble, and in the end, they would lose control of their body and fall into the abyss. However, of course, Lu Chen was not an ordinary person. Even compared to ordinary cultivators, his mind was much calmer and more tenacious, probably because he had seen too many life and death situations. He just stuck his back to the cliff, and then began to move forward step by step. During this process, his face was calm and indifferent, as if there was no expression, including when his eyes swept across the dark abyss in front of him. There seemed to be no fluctuations, as if it was no different from walking on the flat ground. Just like that, he walked slowly, and soon, he had walked more than 10 feet. However, when he occasionally turned his head back, he was startled. He saw that Atu was still standing in the same place, and did not walk with him on this narrow path. Lu Chen stopped and shouted behind him, "What's wrong? Are you afraid?" Atsu glanced at the bottomless abyss at the bottom of the valley, and still did not seem to have any reaction. Lu Chen thought for a moment, and walked back with his back to the cliff, jumped back to Atsu's side, and said, "There are two ways. One is, I will take you, and the other is, you can hide in the tree hole, and I will take you there." Atsu's head tilted, and seemed to look at Lu Chen with some doubt and confusion. Lu Chen smiled, reached out to touch Atsu's head, and said, "It's okay, this kind of terrain is really too dangerous, and too difficult to walk, let alone you, even I have to." Before he finished speaking, Atsu suddenly raised a front foot, pushed Lu Chen's hand away, and then barked at him, looking a little disdainful. Lu Chen retracted his hand in shock. Just as he was about to speak, he saw the big black dog suddenly leap up, and then jump onto the precipice path. It didn't even look at the narrowness of the path, and actually ran forward as if it was flying, easily and effortlessly. It didn't fear the dangers around it at all, and it walked extremely steadily as if it was running on flat ground. It didn't seem to be any slower than running on the mountains outside, and in the blink of an eye, it had run far away. After a while, Atsu stopped in the distance, turned around, and barked proudly at Lu Chen, who was still standing on the edge of the cliff, a little stunned. "Damn it!" Lu Chen, who had always been calm, suddenly cursed, and said angrily, "Stupid dog, so you think I walk too slowly?" Chapter 362. Sometimes, Lu Chen felt that the black dog he had raised was not a dog, but another kind of animal. He had never seen a dog that could jump up and down such a dangerous cliff as if it was walking on flat ground. Even if the path was extremely narrow, even if the precipice was very dangerous, and there were hard stone protrusions from time to time, Atu did not seem to care about all these hardships. On the contrary, it seemed to be enjoying itself as it walked freely. There were many places that seemed dangerous, where one wrong step could cause one to fall into a bottomless abyss, but the black dog did not even look at them as it leaped over them. Sometimes, it would even grab onto a hard rock and swing over, causing people to be extremely frightened. The dangerous moments made them want to break out in cold sweat for it. However, this big black dog did not seem to care at all. Instead, it would turn its head from time to time to look at Lu Chen, who was steadily moving forward step by step, sticking close to the precipice. It would bark a few times, and then it simply stopped and waited. There was a hint of disdain in its pair of big dog eyes. Lu Chen walked over slowly, glared at the dog, and said, "What are you looking at? Have you never seen a human walking before?" Atsu grinned, stood up, wagged its tail, and continued to walk forward. However, its movements were much lighter than Lu Chen's, and it ran a long distance in 2 or 3 steps. Looking at the huge black dog walking on the narrow precipice path, it seemed particularly uncoordinated. It seemed that it would fall at any time, but the dog was so steady that it was appalling. In the end, Lu Chen could only shake his head and sigh. He muttered, "Is this a dog or a monkey?" Of course, Atsu was still a dog, although the dog had changed a lot. Lu Chen recalled the time when he was still in Kunlun Mountain a few years ago. It seemed that during that period of time, Atsu was let loose by him at will. It ran around the vast forest and wilderness of Kunlun Mountain all day long. Could it be that the ability to climb mountains and cross rivers was trained at that time? However, there were many wild dogs in this world, and there were many that lived in the wild all day long. But apart from the one in front of him, it seemed that it was difficult to find another big dog that could have this kind of ability. Therefore, it seemed that the only explanation was that Atsu had advanced to become a holy beast. However, although he complained, Lu Chen obviously would not be angry because of this. In fact, the sudden display of Atsu's ability made Lu Chen a lot less worried. At least he did not have to consider leaving Atsu alone in the tree hole. Perhaps it was because the tree hole was too lonely, and too depressing. It was fine if Lu Chen was there, but if Lu Chen left for the outside world for a while, when he came back, Atsu would become extremely manic. He did not know if it was because of fear of Atsu. So, Lu Chen tried to avoid leaving Atsu alone in the tree hole. This canyon was not a straight line that led to the end. Instead, it was more like a twisting long snake swimming in this mysterious great snow mountain, meandering forward. As Lu Chen and Atsu gradually went deeper, they gradually saw a scene that had not been seen by the outside world for many years. The canyon was sometimes narrow and sometimes wide, and the cliffs on both sides were constantly changing according to the mountain. At the narrowest part, the cliffs on both sides seemed to almost stick together, so much so that Lu Chen could even touch the stone wall on the opposite side if he stretched out his hand. But after walking for a while, the cliffs on both sides suddenly opened up, and the cliffs on both sides were suddenly separated by hundreds of feet. It was so far that it seemed that he could not even see the opposite side clearly. There was no snow in the sky, but there were no birds flying over the canyon either. After the never-ending snowstorm temporarily stopped, there was no other sound here. Everything was a little scary, and only the sunlight falling from the sky in the distance shone into half of the canyon, adding a trace of vitality and warmth to the place. Many of the demonic beasts in the Great Snow Mountain seemed to be very disgusted with this canyon, so even after walking for a long time, Lu Chen did not see any demonic beasts here. This made him a little puzzled, because according to what Hui Yen said that day, a giant wolf demonic beast had appeared here. He quietly walked alone in this actually incomparably dangerous canyon. Other than Atsu, there were no other living creatures. After walking for a long time in this kind of place, it was easy to have a feeling of being forgotten by the whole world. But, just like this, Lu Chen walked in silence for a day. When the sky was getting dark, Lu Chen finally found a slightly more spacious place on this dangerous cliff path. In fact, it was only a small platform 3 to 4 feet wide, and the stone surface was slightly protruding, but it could be considered as a rare place to rest on this road. Lu Chen looked ahead, only to see that as far as his eyes could see, the cliff path was still winding forward, and he could not see the end at all. After a few twists and turns, it turned into a place where he could not see clearly. Similarly, the mysterious canyon that he was in at the moment, even though he had walked in it for a whole day, was still winding forward, as if there was no end. Lu Chen whistled to the front. Atsu heard it, turned back to look, and then walked back along the stone wall. Lu Chen patted its head and said, "It's getting dark, let's rest here for the night." The cliff path in the canyon was a natural barrier. Walking in the day was an extremely dangerous thing, not to mention at night it was pitch black. It was really possible to fall into the abyss with one wrong step at any time. Even a bold person like Lu Chen did not dare to take this risk. Atsu lay down next to him. This small stone platform was not very big, and with the two of them here, it suddenly felt a little crowded. Lu Chen simply sat with his back against the stone wall and let Atsu lie on his thighs. This way, not only did it save space, but being covered by Atu was also like having a warm and thick quilt on his body. It was very warm. After the sky turned dark, Lu Chen hugged Atsu, and for a moment, he also felt a little warm in his heart. He smiled slightly, and then closed his eyes. Compared to the quiet Lu Chen, Atsu was a little bit restless. Its huge head kept twisting left and right, but fortunately, it probably knew that this place was not a place where it could do whatever it wanted, so most of the time it was quite obedient. Just like this, one person and one dog stayed quietly in this canyon until the last bit of light in the sky disappeared above the canyon. Darkness suddenly came, like a tide, instantly drowning everything. There was still no wind or snow at night, but it began to gradually become colder. There wasn't a single ray of light left, right, front, and back. There was a feeling of loneliness and desolation. The darkness even gave people the illusion that the abyss was right beside them, within reach, and they would fall into it with just a slight flip. There was nothing above and below them, and they were alone on the precipice. It was as if they were the only people left in the whole world at this moment. Atsu's body suddenly moved in the darkness, then it turned its head and looked at Lu Chen. Lu Chen's hands were still on Atsu, and in the darkness, he saw Atsu's eyes. That pair of eyes with a bit of faint green, there seemed to be a flickering flame in the pupils, but also like a strange mirror, reflecting a vague shadow. Lu Chen stared at this pair of strange eyes, staring at the reflection in the depths of the eyes, watching it twisting with the flame, and remained silent. After a while, suddenly, the green light in Atsu's eyes suddenly brightened, as if it suddenly wanted to jump. Lu Chen was taken aback, and he quickly used his hands to pull Atsu's body. On this stone platform, which was not very big, there was no room for too much movement. After being pulled by him, Atsu seemed to think of the current situation, and its body quieted down. However, its emotions did not calm down along with its forcefully suppressed body. On the contrary, it seemed to become more and more agitated. It began to let out a deep roar, and its sharp teeth began to grind, making a clattering sound as if two sharp blades were clashing against each other. Lu Chen hugged its body tightly, and the pupil in his eyes slightly contracted. He gently pressed Atsu's head against his chest. Atsu seemed to understand what he meant, and finally calmed down a little, but Lu Chen could still feel that this black wolf's body seemed to be trembling slightly. "What's wrong?" He lowered his voice and asked softly. Atu turned his head and called out in a low voice to the people below. Lu Chen took a deep look at it, took a deep breath, and said in a low voice, "Is there something down there?" Atsu did not have any reaction, nor did it make any sound, but from the feeling that came from his arm, it seemed that this big dog's heartbeat and blood flow were all very fast. Lu Chen let out a soft breath, nodded to Atsu, and then tilted his body, slowly began to tilt his body. Bit by bit, without any sound, he stretched his head to the side, and looked at the bottom of the stone platform, at the dark and bottomless black crack. Under the stone platform, it was as dark as the sea. But at this moment, there were already waves. The darkness was like a tide, wave after wave, surging and slapping, as if there was something strange twisting, circling, and struggling under the darkness. It roared silently in the darkness, and bit by bit, it surged upwards. Chapter 363. The night was too dark and dense. It was impossible to clearly see what was in the darkness below. However, the aura coming from the space below him was abnormally majestic and powerful, causing Lu Chen to involuntarily have the illusion that he was as small as an ant. At that moment, countless thoughts flashed through Lu Chen's mind, and he also thought of the most important reason that made the Great Snow Mountain a forbidden place in the human world. In addition to the harsh and cold wind and snow in the mountain, there were also those unimaginably powerful and mysterious monsters. According to the legends, the most powerful demon beasts were primordial mutants that hid in the hidden corners of the Great Snow Mountain. They were extremely powerful, and they were not inferior to the perfected monarchs of the Soul Formation realm, and might even be stronger. Lu Chen didn't know if there was such a terrifying monster in the canyon under him at the moment, but in terms of feeling, he felt that it was very likely, because he had never seen such a terrifying aura and huge momentum in his life. At this moment, it seemed that the whole canyon was trembling, and Lu Chen clearly felt that the stone wall behind him was also trembling non-stop. For a moment, he almost subconsciously wanted to run back to the mysterious tree hole and the seed with Atsu in his arms, but when this thought flashed through his mind, he quickly suppressed it. This place was too dangerous. The small stone platform they were on looked so fragile and narrow. Lu Chen had no confidence in what would happen to the lone seed after they hid in the tree hole to take refuge. Perhaps the terrifying monster that was about to come out would not care about this tiny thing, but in the chaos, there was a great possibility that this seed would fall into the bottomless abyss underground. At that time, perhaps it would be the truly terrifying place. Lu Chen also didn't want to find out what kind of strange things were in the depths of the dark underground. Therefore, at that critical moment, he suppressed all his fear and impulsiveness in the end, and with unimaginable determination, he hugged Atsu tightly against the cold stone wall, widened his eyes, and looked at the dark world in front of him. The darkness was rolling like a tide, and a terrible roar came from afar, making people tremble. The mountains began to tremble, and then, a rumbling sound like thunder came from the depths of the earth, as if something was climbing up step by step from the depths of the earth. Every step seemed to cross a large stone wall, making the darkness thicker and the black tide more turbulent. Atsu's body began to tremble, as if it was instinctively afraid. Lu Chen could even feel that its muscles were twisting and trembling, and its blood flow was speeding up. It even had a feeling that it was going to jump up and run for its life in the next moment. However, in such a dark night, which mysterious and terrifying monster was nearby, running away at this moment was almost equivalent to seeking death. So, Lu Chen suddenly grabbed Atsu's head and hugged it tightly in his arms. Then, he lowered his body and covered Atsu's head with his chest. In the darkness, he looked like a father, using his body to block all the dangers for his child, blocking all the darkness outside. Atsu's body, which was about to go berserk, suddenly trembled. Perhaps it felt the warmth of Lu Chen's chest, or perhaps it heard the heartbeat of this man's chest, or perhaps it was comforted by the embrace. Atsu quieted down and no longer made any movements. It just silently nestled in Lu Chen's arms. The night was dark and cold, the black tide was dancing wildly, and the black shadows were going crazy. In the corner of the shadow, two tiny ant-like shadows were still holding on, silently enduring. When the darkness boiled to its limit and the mountain shook violently, an indescribable aura suddenly burst out of the ground. Lu Chen looked at it closely, but he couldn't see it clearly no matter how hard he tried. Everything was covered in darkness, but the darkness itself seemed to have merged into one, slowly rising from the crack in the ground not far away from him. It felt like if Lu Chen stretched out his hand, he might be able to touch the monster in the darkness. They were so close, as if there was only a thin line between life and death. Lu Chen held Atsu, gritted his teeth, and remained motionless. The terrifying monster in the darkness didn't seem to notice that there were two tiny creatures on the cliff of the canyon, or to it, those two things were not much different from real ants. The huge shadow was almost impossible to see in the night, and Lu Chen couldn't tell how big the monster was. Perhaps the darkness itself increased people's fear, making people imagine the monster to be even more terrifying. However, he could sense that the monster had left the crevice and was climbing upwards. Then, it left the canyon. When the boundless darkness surged to the top of the mysterious canyon, a terrifying howl came from the top of the mountain. The howl shook the surrounding wilderness and the mountains. Rocks of all sizes began to fall from the precipice. Lu Chen endured the pain of being smashed by the rocks as he tried his best to maintain his balance. Suddenly, he muttered a curse, but no one could hear what he was cursing. The unknown underground monster appeared in the night. Of course, it couldn't just stand on the top of the mountain and howl a few times. Soon, Lu Chen felt that the breath started to go away. At the same time, there was a burst of indescribable strange sounds in the mountains further away. It sounded like a fight, a howl, a shout, and a cry of despair. Is it looking for food? This was the first thought that came to Lu Chen's mind. But in this world of ice and snow, the only food that could be found were those equally powerful and fierce monsters. Lu Chen sucked in a breath of cold air and sat still in his original spot. The dark night seemed to be particularly desolate and long. He didn't know how long he had waited, but at a certain moment in the night, suddenly, the terrifying and powerful breath returned again. In an instant, the same scene of the earth shaking and the mountains boiling happened again. Atsu was a little excited again, but under Lu Chen's comfort, he held back. Then, Lu Chen watched the huge shadow slowly return to the bottomless abyss under the cliff in the darkness until everything calmed down. The night was cold, and he couldn't see his fingers in front of him. It was as if nothing had happened in the darkness. However, there was a different breath here, and Lu Chen could feel it. It was the faint smell of blood that came with the wind. No one knew when Atsu fell asleep, lying on Lu Chen's lap and sleeping soundly. But Lu Chen didn't sleep. His eyes were always open, looking at the darkness in front of him, until dawn. When the sun rose, the first ray of light dispelled the darkness here, and Lu Chen saw the canyon again. It was quiet in the canyon, and it seemed to be exactly the same as yesterday. It was so quiet as if there were no living creatures here at all. Lu Chen sighed softly, then patted Atsu's head, and woke the big black dog up from its dream. Atsu woke up with sleepy eyes. He first looked left and right, then looked up at the sky. After staring blankly for a while, he suddenly let out a happy cry. He then jumped up and ran forward while wagging his tail. After running for a while, he even turned back and barked at Lu Chen, as if urging him to hurry up. Lu Chen also stood up with a smile, and let out a long sigh of relief. Then, after stretching his body, he continued to walk forward. They walked forward for about 100 feet. Suddenly, Atsu stopped. It didn't bark, nor did it walk. It just looked up at the high mountain cliff in front of it. Lu Chen walked behind it, and was slightly surprised. He also looked up, and then his body also trembled. On the towering precipice of the canyon, under the illumination of the rare sunlight, there were a few huge claw marks on the stone walls, like sharp blades directly cutting open the incomparably hard stone walls. And at a higher place, at the peak of the mountain, there was a large mass of shocking blood stains. Some places had dried up, but there was still more blood dripping down from the stone walls of the mountain, like a blood waterfall, so frighteningly displayed in front of their eyes. The smell of blood in the air suddenly became extremely strong. Chapter 364. Lu Chen and Atsu both stared at the blood stains on the mountain for a long time. Then, Lu Chen retracted his gaze, patted Atsu's head gently, and said in a low voice, "Let's go." Atsu looked back at him, then continued to walk forward without saying a word. Although the canyon was already quiet, although both of them were still walking steadily, the atmosphere seemed to be faintly gloomier and more depressing than before. In contrast, Lu Chen seemed to be calmer, and his face was calm, while Atsu was not as cheerful as it was yesterday. They continued along the path of the precipice, and the ravine stretched on before them in all its twists and turns, and still seemed to have no end. The length of the canyon was somewhat beyond Lu Chen's expectation. After walking for a long time and still not seeing the exit, Lu Chen's face began to become a little gloomy. In the mysterious tree hole in the seed, he had stored enough food and water, which was enough to support him and Atsu for a long time, so he was not worried about food. But the most worrisome thing at the moment was another matter. It had been a day and a half since he first entered the canyon. In a year, there were only 3 sunny days in the Great Snow Mountain, which meant that in another half a day, the unusually violent snowstorm would flood this place again. Lu Chen still clearly remembered the scene of the snowstorm when he first came out of the canyon that day. It was too difficult and dangerous to walk through this cliff path in that kind of situation. However, what was more troublesome was that he had now walked so far, and it was almost impossible to go back. This was probably the so-called dilemma. Maybe Atsu did not think so much, but since just now, it had been looking back at Lu Chen from time to time, with a doubtful and worried look in its eyes. It probably wanted to see if Lu Chen had the intention to go back. Lu Chen understood what Atsu meant, but after a moment of thinking, he quickly made a decision. "Let's go, Atsu." He pointed to the front of the canyon. Atsu stared at him for a moment, and then, as if a huge stone had been lifted from his heart, he no longer hesitated and paced back and forth. Even the initial pressure seemed to have disappeared. He returned to his original relaxed self and began to run forward. After running for a while, it turned back and barked twice, as if it was complaining that Lu Chen was too slow. Lu Chen couldn't help but laugh. As they continued to walk forward, all kinds of strange scenery in this mysterious canyon gradually appeared in front of them. There were all kinds of strange peaks and rocks, steep cliffs, and precipices like swords and mirrors, decorated with white snow, which was also a rare wonder in the world. But as they went deeper into the canyon, Lu Chen soon saw that on the mountain walls on both sides of the canyon, there were more scratch marks that he had seen before. It looked like some kind of unknown giant beast had climbed here, and at every distance, he could vaguely see a little bit of dried blood stain. He glanced at the dark abyss that he couldn't see clearly, frowned, and then continued walking forward. The days slowly passed as they walked and stopped. They still couldn't see the exit of the canyon, but the huge claw marks constantly reminded them of the danger that was lurking everywhere. The sky gradually darkened again. Before the evening came, Lu Chen and Atsu finally found a place to rest. It was similar to the stone platform they stayed on last night. It was also a slightly wider platform, but it was better than yesterday. The stone wall here was probably peeled off over the years, forming a concave gap. It was about the width of a person, and could barely be regarded as a small cave. After seeing this place and seeing that it was getting late, even though it was not dusk yet, Lu Chen quickly decided to stop here to rest. Walking in this unknown place was inexplicably heavy pressure. Knowing nothing about the front, he could only take one step at a time. Although Lu Chen appeared to be very calm and collected most of the time, from yesterday until now, it was equivalent to him walking on this extremely dangerous precipice path for 2 whole days. His back was pressed against the stone wall, and beneath his feet was a bottomless abyss. His life was in danger at all times, and even when he was resting last night, there were still those mysterious and terrifying monsters appearing and disappearing. He also did not sleep for the whole night, and kept his eyes open until dawn. After being tense for such a long time, even if he had a strong will and cultivation, he still felt a deep sense of exhaustion. So, after choosing a place to rest, he called out to Atu and curled up in the small cave. It was said to be half a small cave because the stone wall was only slightly concave. At most, his body could only lean on it, but most of his hands and feet were still outside. But even so, this kind of terrain still made Lu Chen feel a little relieved. Atsu ran over and looked at him curiously, then looked left and right, and finally looked at the stone wall on the opposite side. There was a huge claw mark, which was cut down from the mountain cliff. It was exposed in front of them, and it was about 100 feet away. Atsu looked for a while, and then shrunk its body. Just like yesterday, it once again lay down beside Lu Chen. Lu Chen smiled, hugged Atsu, and then one man and one dog silently watched the sky slowly darken. The sky darkened, night once again arrived. Sometimes, people would suddenly feel a kind of insignificance, indescribably aware of the fragility of life. Also, the world was so vast, the creation of heaven and earth was so mysterious. This kind of feeling would always follow people throughout their lives, always appearing in a lonely moment in the dead of night, or when you looked up at the boundless sky alone. Lu Chen was in the darkness, quietly looking at the dark sky. At that moment, he suddenly remembered many things from a long time ago. When he was young, he had once firmly believed in this belief, and he did not hesitate to risk his life for it. That belief was the only thing that allowed him to survive through the most difficult and dangerous days. Until today, he had never wavered much in that belief. But there were many, many things that were once engraved in his heart. He had once felt so much pain that he thought he would never forget them. But on this night, when he suddenly thought of them, he realized that he hadn't thought of them for a long time. Time was like a tide, always silently washing away his memories over and over again, diluting the pain and blurring the past. It turned out that emotions would eventually fade. Whether it was hatred or love, after a long time, would only an indifferent shadow be left? Lu Chen quietly looked up at the dark sky, staring at the figures of the past in his memory. Then there was a whistling sound, echoing in the dark abyss, and the dark tide surged again. Atsu's body trembled, and it leaned closer to him. Lu Chen hugged its body, and just like yesterday, he bent down to shelter it from the darkness. Atsu quietened down. The darkness roared up. In the darkness of the night, the huge and terrifying black shadow appeared again, violently tearing at the black night and the mountain. When it crossed the mountain peak and roared at the night sky, the earth seemed to tremble because of it. Despite last night's experience, Lu Chen could not help but be shocked by this unusually powerful aura, and subconsciously held his breath. That black shadow was perhaps the king of the night, looking disdainfully in all directions. After roaring, it might have turned around to look for food, but it was also at this moment that the mountains suddenly became silent, and all sounds abruptly returned to silence. The shadow seemed to stop, and suddenly turned around, looking into the distance. Lu Chen seemed to sense something, and looked up. At that moment, his heart suddenly beat faster. In the pitch-black night, on the opposite side of the terrifying black shadow, separated by the dark canyon and abyss, another huge shadow slowly appeared on the opposite mountain top. Lu Chen could not see the outline of the appearance, and could only see the two huge eyes in the darkness, dark green and deep, with an indescribable aura of death. That was a cruel and vicious gaze, as if it wanted to tear everything apart and devour everything. Even when it saw the giant beast of the King of Darkness, it was the same. In his arms, Atsu's body suddenly trembled, and then it raised its head, and looked at the shadow above the mountain peak. Chapter 365. Lu Chen felt Atsu's strange movements in his arms and was about to look down to see what was wrong. Who knew that at this moment, in the darkness above them, the two terrifying monsters that were hidden in the darkness suddenly let out a deafening roar at the same time. The voice was like a thunderclap. Even though Lu Chen was quite a distance away, he still felt as if his ears were ringing and buzzing. At the same time, under the huge dark sky above, two huge shadows leaped into the sky. In an instant, all the darkness in the world boiled, and the wind and clouds rolled. With a loud bang, they collided with each other in midair. The towering and majestic Great Snow Mountain seemed to tremble violently at this moment. Deafening roars resounded through the sky. The two terrifying beasts who seemed to belong to the darkness fought fiercely. For a moment, the mountains shook and the earth quaked. For Lu Chen and Atsu, this unusually dangerous canyon, including the bottomless abyss underground, was a place where lives could be taken at any time. But for the two terrifying beasts above, perhaps this was just an inconspicuous crack in their eyes. They didn't care about the crack under their feet at all. Just like that, they fought violently on the top of the mountain. Amidst countless roars and roars, hard rocks of all sizes were easily smashed, torn, and fell. Lu Chen and Atsu felt as though it was raining violently. When immortals fight, mortals suffer. This was probably what it meant. Lu Chen and Atsu, who were originally hiding in the cliff path below, were a little dumbfounded. However, there was nowhere for them to escape. Firstly, the size and strength of these two enormous beasts were too enormous. As soon as they started fighting, it instantly affected a wide area of at least a few hundred meters. Rocks rumbled and fell like rain everywhere, and it was similarly extremely dangerous. Another reason was that the night was too dark, and under the circumstances that one couldn't even see one's own fingers in front of one's face. If one wanted to flee for one's life, then how many boulders would fall? This wasn't much different from giving their lives away. But if they stayed where they were, it seemed that the situation wouldn't be any better. Lu Chen only felt that the mountain behind him and under his feet kept shaking and trembling. At the same time, he could even hear the stiff and cold sound of the mountain cracking. Just from the sound alone, he seemed to be able to imagine the many cracks that suddenly appeared on the cliff behind him. Gradually, along with the violent wind, the rocks of all sizes that began to fall from above also began to fall. All the hair on Atsu's body seemed to stand up at that moment. It stood up with a roar and desperately turned its head to look around, as if it was looking for a place to escape. However, it was surrounded by darkness, and it couldn't see any way out. The dog was so anxious that it stomped its feet. Just as it was about to recklessly rush out of the small stone platform, Lu Chen dragged it back from behind and grabbed it tightly. At the same time, he growled, "If you stay here, you'll die if you go out." After being roared at by him, Atsu temporarily calmed down a little, but Lu Chen could still feel the fear from its slightly trembling body. Lu Chen could still be considered calm, but he was also very nervous. He hugged Atsu tightly, and his mind was spinning anxiously, trying to think of a way to avoid this unexpected disaster, when he heard the sound of a boulder falling. It was the rocks that fell from the sky, smashing fiercely on the opposite stone wall. Countless small rocks shot out in all directions, and then fell along with the rocks. The sound of cracking and rumbling echoed through the canyon, and then, more and bigger rocks began to fall. In the darkness, countless black shadows could be seen moving crazily, and no one knew what kind of fate awaited them in the next moment. Lu Chen grabbed Atsu tightly and squeezed into the narrow hole with all his strength. At the same time, he curled up his body. Just as he shrank his feet into the hole, he heard a loud bang, and a big rock fell heavily on the small stone platform, directly smashing half of the small stone platform, and then turned into gravel and fell down. Lu Chen and Atsu were dumbfounded. That was the moment when they were abnormally close to death, but at this time, they didn't even have the time to sigh or feel any lingering fear or hope that they might be lucky. Because more and more falling rocks, accompanied by terrifying roars and sounds of fighting, continued to fall. As the earth shook and the mountains shook, countless large and small rocks turned into black shadows and fell one after another. While they were panicking, Lu Chen suddenly felt the wind above their heads. He and Atsu looked up at the same time, only to see a huge black shadow falling from the sky, and it was smashing towards their heads. There was no way to dodge, no way to dodge, no place to hide, no way to escape. Lu Chen's pupils constricted, and Atsu began to howl madly. In this critical moment, the black shadow continued to smash through the cliffs and boulders, but didn't change course. Instead, it fell faster and faster, as fast as lightning. In the time it takes for a spark to fly off of a piece of flint, Lu Chen finally let out an enraged curse. He held Atsu in his arms and pressed a hand to his chest. Black flames burned fiercely in the darkness of the night, then vanished. In an instant, he and Atsu suddenly disappeared in this narrow space, and a moment later, a huge rock smashed down. With a loud bang, the platform was smashed into pieces, and then it fell down, straight into the bottomless dark abyss. And in the still deep night, on the majestic and vast snowy mountain, under the boundless dark sky, there was still an earth-shattering battle going on. In the darkness, the kings were fighting, and no one knew what it was for. When a white light flashed in front of them, the bodies of Lu Chen and Atsu fell heavily on the ground in the tree hole. One man and one dog lay on the ground, and neither of them got up immediately. It seemed that they still hadn't woken up from the collapse of the world just now. After a while, their breathing seemed to gradually calm down. Lu Chen was still lying on the ground, and Atsu turned around and stood up. It first looked around. This tree hole, which was no longer unfamiliar to it, made it feel a sense of security. It then wagged its tail, walked to Lu Chen's side, lowered its head, and rubbed its head against his body. Lu Chen slowly sat up. Like Atsu, he also turned his head to look at this familiar tree hole, and then he smiled bitterly. "Oh no, Atsu." He reached out his hand and touched Atsu's head. There was a trace of helplessness on his face, and he said, "We are still forced to come here, and we don't know what's going on outside." Atsu turned its head to look at the mountain of food in the tree hole, and barked at Lu Chen. Lu Chen shook his head, and after a moment of silence, he said, "No, we can't wait too long this time. We have to get out of here as soon as possible." As he spoke, Lu Chen stretched out his hand and picked up a simple wooden hourglass from the ground not far away. He had casually made it when he was still in the Black Fire tribe, so that he could keep track of time in this tree hole where he didn't know the flow of time. He stared at the hourglass for a moment, then turned it upside down on the ground, and said to Atsu, "At most 2 or 3 hours, we have to get out of here." Atsu tilted its head, and seemed to be a little puzzled. Lu Chen sighed and said, "In a few hours, it will be almost dawn. I don't know if the two monsters will continue to fight, and I don't know if the situation outside will be dangerous. But I'm afraid that it will be a disaster. This seed is very likely to fall into that crack." Speaking of this, he smiled bitterly again, as if he was also lamenting the helplessness of fate, and then said, "But, no matter what, we still have to get out, because tomorrow is the last sunny day." He looked at Atsu and said, "We are trapped in the canyon. No matter what, tomorrow is the last chance, we have to go." Chapter 366. Time was like the sand in the hourglass on the ground, slowly falling bit by bit, silently passing by. When people knew nothing about the future or the outside world, it took a lot of courage to take that step. For a while, Lu Chen sat quietly, staring at the hourglass without saying a word. Atsu did not seem to be in a frenzy, or perhaps it was not fully aware of the danger of going out this time. It just lay on the ground next to Lu Chen, sticking close to him. However, there was a lot of food here, including its favorite dried meat. It could be seen that Atsu was different from usual. It was quiet in the tree hole, as if it had been like this for a long time, and Lu Chen and the others seemed to be just a small splash in the long river of time. Under all the abnormalities, a small anomaly could not make a big splash. Lu Chen raised his head and looked around the tree hole. He was very familiar with this place. From the first time he found this place, he had been here countless times. This mysterious and ancient tree hole had given him a new life. It had supported him through all kinds of pain that he almost fell into hell, and helped him break free from the terrible curse at the last moment. For so many years, this had been his last haven. When he was in the most painful, desperate, and sad times, only this tree hole would be his only shelter, his last place to escape. For so many years, only Atsu could completely share this secret with him. After leaving this place this time, would there be a chance to come back after leaving this place? Lu Chen was not sure, but he was not unfamiliar with this feeling. He was not even afraid. Many years ago, he had experienced many tests of life and death. He just looked at the tree hole and suddenly remembered the legend he had heard before. Then he looked at the empty tree hole and said to himself, "I heard that you have a few companions of the same origin. Yezi? Branches? I don't know when you guys will be together again." The tree hole was silent, as if it had no reaction to his words. However, in the past 10 years, the tree hole had never reacted. Lu Chen naturally wouldn't treat this tree hole as a sentient being. He just casually said that, then closed his eyes and continued to be quiet. Slowly, the sand in the hourglass was about to run out. Time flew by. Atsu squinted his eyes, and Lu Chen leaned against the wall. Everything looked so quiet, as if time had stopped. Then, Lu Chen suddenly opened his eyes. Atsu seemed to have sensed something and looked up. Then, he saw Lu Chen silently stand up. His face was expressionless as he said in a flat tone, "Atsu, let's go." A white light flashed in the air. Like duckweed in a big river, like a glimmer between heaven and earth, like an ant in the world, so small and humble, quietly appeared in this world. After the light passed, Lu Chen and Atsu suddenly appeared in the air. After a moment of pause, their bodies suddenly fell down. It was really a flash of lightning. The world seemed to be still spinning. There were mountains, rocks, wind, clouds, light and darkness. There was also a strange boundary where light and shadow intertwined. It was like a turbulent wave, rushing from a certain direction. Lu Chen's pupils suddenly dilated at that moment. He suddenly let out a furious roar. The world was spinning upside down, and everything was screaming crazily in his ears. However, he still stubbornly shook off all these terrifying phantoms. His eyes stared at all the terrifying phantoms for a moment. It was the most silent, most solid, and seemingly the farthest stone. Stone wall. That was the stone wall of the mountain. He was roaring. Then, he stretched out his hands with all his might and desperately grabbed the stone wall. There was only a series of ear-piercing crashing sounds. The stone cracked, and blood flowed. His body was still sliding down. His hands couldn't grab anything, but he desperately grabbed every crack that had the slightest resistance. After sliding down 7 or 8 times, his right hand suddenly grabbed a stone that was firmly protruding out of the wall about half a foot. Who? His body suddenly stopped. His whole body weight was supported by his right hand. At this moment, the chaotic and spinning world finally stopped in his eyes and returned to its original appearance. There was a severe pain from his right hand, as if his flesh was torn apart. However, Lu Chen's reaction to this was only a slight frown. Even his expression didn't change much. He just hung alone in the air and gently took a breath. The whole world seemed to slowly become clear at this moment. The sky was bright. There was light falling from the sky above the canyon. The deep night had indeed passed. The precipice path that he was originally staying on was no longer in front of him. After looking carefully, Lu Chen found that the path did not disappear. Instead, it appeared more than 10 feet above his head. In other words, he had fallen from that precipice path and fell more than 10 feet in one breath. Lu Chen subconsciously looked down. He saw that below his feet, the deep and dark place was like a ferocious mouth, as if waiting to swallow him. Lu Chen shook his head. He stretched out his left hand and felt a gap on the stone wall that he could grab. After sharing the burden of his right hand, he let out a sigh of relief. But at this moment, Lu Chen suddenly heard a burst of barking coming from above. Woof, woof, woof. Woof, 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 woof. Lu Chen's spirit was lifted. He looked up and saw a huge black dog's head poking out from the high precipice path. It looked around as if it was looking for something. It was Atsu. After a while, Atsu saw Lu Chen hanging at the bottom of the cliff. It suddenly became spirited and barked at Lu Chen. Lu Chen also laughed, then he really laughed. He scolded the black dog that was barking happily, then he smiled and said, "Stupid dog, I didn't expect you to be so good." No matter how anxious Atsu was, although Lu Chen seemed to be in a desperate and dangerous situation at the moment, he was still very calm. After his body climbed to the precipice and stood firmly, he began to try to climb up. Since this mountain was originally called a precipice, it was naturally extremely steep and difficult to climb. However, probably after the earth-shattering monster battle last night, the earth shook and the mountain collapsed. Suddenly, there were countless large and small cracks on the precipice and abruptly cracked rocks, making it much easier to climb than before. Just like this, Lu Chen slowly fumbled along the way, looking for a foothold and a place to hold on to. He climbed up bit by bit, and after half an hour, he actually climbed back to the precipice path. When he let out a long breath and sat on the 2 to 3 feet wide precipice path, Atsu next to him ran over with a joyful cry. It used its head to rub against Lu Chen's body, looking very excited. Lu Chen laughed and hugged Atsu's neck. He also patted Atsu's head lightly. "It's not easy, I survived again this time," Lu Chen murmured. Atsu raised its head and looked very happy. Just when it was about to bark at Lu Chen, its eyes suddenly flashed with a green light. It saw the precipice path behind Lu Chen more than 20 feet away. That place was originally also a precipice. Suddenly, another arm stretched out from beneath the rock, and then tightly grabbed onto the edge of the small path. Chapter 367. That was a hand. However, it did not look like a human hand. The black dog could tell at a glance, but to be on the safe side, or perhaps it wanted to make a comparison, it lowered its head and glanced at Lu Chen's palm. One was a hand of flesh and blood, with rosy, lustrous skin, and full of vitality, while the other was not. The palm that suddenly appeared on the edge of the cliff path was gray, cold, hard, and solid. It looked like a rock, but compared to a real rock, there seemed to be something strange about this hand. Life. The rock-like palm abruptly tightened its grip, just like how Lu Chen had done all he could to climb up from the bottom of the cliff. Then, even more gray appeared. Several sharp thorns grew out of the slender arm, and there were also black webbed membranes growing on the underside of his ribs. Soon, a strange and ear-piercing scream came from the bottom of the cliff. It was like a bloodthirsty monster slowly revealing its fangs. Atsu stared at the hand, and the hair on its neck slowly stood up. Then, it suddenly let out a low roar, as if it was facing a formidable enemy. Lu Chen was startled. Then, as if he felt something, he suddenly turned around and saw the scene that Atsu saw just now. Then, under their astonished gazes, the gray shadow in that place swayed, and a head that was smaller than what they had expected was raised from under the rock. At first glance, it looked like an evil spirit. It was a ferocious and ugly head, with sharp fangs protruding from its bloody mouth. Its bell-like eyes were exceptionally large, and the skin on its face was as hard as stone. Even the roar of this monster sounded like a pile of rocks squeezed together and rubbed against each other. When this strange and terrifying monster appeared, it immediately stared at Lu Chen and Atsu, then opened its mouth and roared at them. Following this fierce roar, a pair of black membranous wings suddenly spread out behind it. There were countless thorns on the wings, and there were several sharp claws on the edge of the wings. The sharp claws even reflected a white light. Lu Chen's face darkened. He didn't recognize this monster. He hadn't even heard of it before, let alone seen it. He suspected that this strange monster, which looked like a giant stone bat, only existed in the Great Snow Mountain. Otherwise, it would be impossible for there to be no records of it in the world for thousands of years. But it was meaningless to think about these things now, because the monster had already soared into the air, flapped its huge membranous wings, and then pounced on him. At that moment, the sky seemed to darken a little. The monster opened its mouth and bared its fangs. It was so aggressive that it looked like it wanted to eat meat and drink blood. In any case, it didn't look like it wanted to make friends. Lu Chen had no choice at all. He stood up abruptly and waved his hand. At the same time, a black dagger suddenly appeared in his hand. Black flames ignited and condensed into a half-foot-long flame that stabbed towards the monster that was pouncing towards him. Almost immediately, Lu Chen used his greatest power. This was because he knew nothing about this kind of monster, and because he suddenly felt a trace of danger from the depths of his heart. The monster that looked like a giant bat pounced over, and its sharp claws were in front of him in the blink of an eye. Lu Chen dodged to the side, but the black dagger in his hand didn't stop. It continued to pierce forward, and directly stabbed the only soft membrane of the monster. This time, Lu Chen felt as if he had stabbed an incomparably hard rock. He could even see sparks flying out from the friction between the sharp blade and the rock. His arm violently shook. The incomparably sharp blade, the killing weapon that had killed many people and pierced through many flesh, was forcibly blocked just like that. But at the same time, the black flames in front of the black dagger seemed to be unaffected by the monster's hard skin, and directly penetrated it, burning into the membrane. In a moment, under the incomparably hard skin, a terrifying blood bag bulged, and the strange blood inside seemed to boil and burn in the time it takes for a spark to fly off a flint. Then, with a boom, it exploded. Blood splattered everywhere, and the color of the blood was impressively black. The monster's head suddenly rose, and it let out an incomparably mournful scream. Its wings desperately flapped, and then it seemed to flap its wings to fly up. However, the membrane that was pierced by Lu Chen's black dagger was obviously flapping very hard, and it seemed to be seriously injured. Lu Chen leaned against the rock, clinging to the mountain wall, holding the dagger in his hand, and stared coldly at the monster in the air above the cliff not far away. Beside him, Atsu also pounced over, roaring loudly at the monster in the air, and also fiercely bared its fangs. The ferocity in the monster's eyes didn't fade at all. Instead, it looked at the two living creatures below even more viciously, but there was still a touch of fear in its eyes. So after a moment, it suddenly flapped its wings and flew back for a distance, then it let out a shrill cry towards the dark bottomless abyss below. Squeak! The shrill cry instantly spread, echoing in this narrow and long canyon, between the mountains, and also in the dark crevice. Lu Chen's heart tightened, and his expression changed slightly. Just as he was about to move, he suddenly heard a burst of strange sounds from the depths of the dark crevice under his feet. After a moment, the world seemed to suddenly turn dark, and the sound of something flapping in the air suddenly sounded. One after another, black shadows pounced out from the depths of the darkness. 1, 2, 3, a dozen, dozens, and even more similar monsters flapped their huge membranous wings and flew out from the depths of the ground, flocking here from all directions. Lu Chen's heart sank, and Atsu's cry was also interrupted. However, in the roar, not long after, they were surrounded by a large black mass of monsters from top to bottom, from front to back. And further away in their line of sight, there seemed to be more monsters rushing over. That scene was like the end of the underworld. Every pair of eyes revealed greed and desire for flesh and blood, and every monster looked extremely bloodthirsty. No one knew which one was the first to lose its patience, but with a shrill cry, it swooped down from midair. Lu Chen, who had cold sweat on his forehead, swung his sword. The monster seemed to know that the dagger was extremely dangerous. It screamed and flapped its wings to avoid it, but its sharp claws scratched the stone wall above Lu Chen's head, instantly tearing the mountain rocks, leaving a few slender cracks, and small stones fell one after another. This action seemed to have suddenly opened the prelude to the siege. All the monsters screamed desperately, crowded in midair, and were about to pounce on Lu Chen. At this critical moment, Lu Chen could no longer care about anything else. He clenched his teeth and directly jumped onto Atsu's back. Then, on this narrow mountain path on this precipice, Lu Chen did not even look at Atsu. He didn't even look at Atu, only growling in a low voice, "Charge!" Roar! Atu let out a furious roar and sprinted forward. And all the monsters in midair seemed to be completely enraged at this moment. Countless strange screams were deafening, countless sharp claws and terrifying membranous wings swarmed over, biting and biting from every direction. From afar, it looked like a terrifying black ball that kept squirming in the darkness, running rapidly on the precipice path. Chapter 368. Countless membrane-winged bats were hovering in the air, crowded together. They seemed to be crowded, but strangely, they never collided with each other, always passing each other by a hair's breadth. Accompanied by countless terrifying and ear-piercing screeches, the demon beasts with bloodthirsty red eyes swooped down ceaselessly. They stretched out their sharp claws and flapped their wings as they desperately clawed at Atu and Lu Chen. They were like a pack of hungry wolves about to tear apart fresh food. However, this food was not dead yet, nor was it frightened by this terrifying scene. Lu Chen no longer looked at the incomparably dangerous precipice under his feet. It was as if he had placed his life completely in Atu's hands. He clenched the black dagger in his hand, struggling to parry and resist the monsters that kept attacking from above, below, left and right. In just a short moment, Lu Chen had discovered that these membrane-winged bat monsters, which he had never heard of before, were extremely powerful. Almost all of his own means did not have much effect on them. Only the power of the black fire seemed to be the natural enemy of these monsters. It could repeatedly disrupt their formation in the chaos, and once it came into contact with the skin and flesh of these monsters, it could immediately burn in and seriously injure them. Not long after, these bloodthirsty and crazy monsters seemed to have understood. They began to fear the black dagger in Lu Chen's hand, especially the black flame that rose from the dagger from time to time. Often, when Lu Chen stabbed with the dagger, the membrane-winged bat monsters in front of him would scream and flap their wings to fly away. In this way, Lu Chen could no longer hurt these monsters as easily as he did at the beginning, but with this layer of fear, these membrane-winged bats did not dare to easily attack. But from the beginning to the end, none of these strange and terrible monsters left. They were still circling around Lu Chen and Atsu, chasing them in the air, screaming and looking for any opportunity to suddenly rush down to attack. At the same time, Atsu seemed to have completely forgotten everything around it. Just like Lu Chen suddenly no longer cared about the things under his feet, and gave his life to this big black dog that could not speak, Atsu also no longer looked up. Those terrible monsters, sharp roars, bloodthirsty eyes, and sharp claws that could tear its body apart, all turned a blind eye to them. The black dog just barked and howled, then ran forward wildly. The cliff path was extremely dangerous, and many places were abnormally narrow. Some sections had even been broken after the accident last night. However, Atsu still rushed forward all the way without looking back. Its body, its movements, were so agile that it was stunning. Like a flash of lightning, or like the most agile ape in the forest, it kept jumping and running in this natural barrier as if it was running on flat ground. It was only because the surrounding membrane-winged bats were all flying monsters that they could keep up with it. Otherwise, they would have been left behind by Atsu a long time ago. It seemed to trust the man on its back wholeheartedly, ignoring all the other demonic beasts and trusting that Lu Chen would be able to protect it. The man and the dog suddenly had such a tacit understanding in the face of life and death. However, the situation was still dangerous. The membrane-winged bats were powerful, numerous, and extremely fast. If it were other beasts, they would have long become food in their stomachs, or lost their footing and fell off the cliff. It could be said to be a miracle that Lu Chen and Atsu were able to hold on until now. But in such a situation, those countless membrane-winged bats still showed no signs of giving up. Under their incessant harassment and attacks, Atsu seemed to be able to hold on as he ran with all his heart, but Lu Chen's complexion gradually turned ashen and unsightly after continuously resisting the numerous demon beasts' attacks without a moment's pause. The spiritual power in his body began to dry up. The dark flame on his black dagger was getting fainter and fainter, and the flame was getting shorter and shorter. As he gradually showed signs of weakness, the surrounding membrane-winged bats suddenly became excited. Their shrill cries became louder and louder, and their blood-red eyes seemed to glow. Their attacks suddenly became even more frenzied, as if these demonic beasts were actually quite intelligent. The great snow mountain, after all, still had an irresistible danger that was almost irresistible. The black ball formed by the membrane-winged bats was getting closer and closer, and the shrieking demon beasts were getting closer and closer with every pounce. The crushed stone walls were sent flying, and the debris kept falling, as if foreshadowing the arrival of the final desperate situation. At this increasingly critical moment, suddenly, Lu Chen heard Atsu under him suddenly let out a long howl, which was not quite the same as its previous barking, and even contained a hint of surprise. He tried his best to stab with his dagger, avoiding a membrane-winged bat that had just rushed over. Taking advantage of the short moment of respite, he suddenly looked back, and his eyes suddenly lit up. He saw that a piece of flat ground suddenly appeared in front of him. This unusually long and dangerous canyon had finally come to an end. The snow-covered ground looked as dazzling as a piece of white jade. Lu Chen's spirit was greatly boosted. Although he did not know how to get rid of these terrible membrane-winged bats for the time being, it was always a good thing to have a change. Otherwise, he, who was almost at the end of his strength, really did not have the confidence to last long on this dangerous precipice trail. Rush over! Lu Chen roared to Atsu. However, almost at the same time, those membrane-winged bats seemed to have felt something, and their offensive suddenly increased, screaming and pouncing madly, several times more ferocious than before. Suddenly, Lu Chen was left and right, and he almost couldn't hold on any longer. Sure enough, after a moment, there was a low hiss, and Lu Chen let out a muffled groan. His body shook violently, but after persisting for a long time, his movements were finally a beat slower. Soon, the slight decline immediately brought serious consequences. A huge membrane-winged bat waved its sharp claws and pounced over. The claws swept past Lu Chen's shoulder, and in an instant, blood appeared. The skin was torn open, and a large piece of flesh was forcibly torn off, blood splattering everywhere. Lu Chen took a deep breath, and his face turned pale. Perhaps it was because they saw and smelled the smell of blood. All the membrane-winged bats around instantly became excited and pounced down together, screaming wildly. The scene was like a black ball suddenly collapsing, concave towards the center. At this moment of life and death, Atsu also seemed to feel the danger. With a fierce howl, it suddenly jumped up in the midst of running, rushing over the canyon in a dangerous gap, and fell heavily on the snowy ground. It also temporarily escaped the attack of those membrane-winged bats. There was a series of strange rumbling sounds behind him, and at that moment, countless membrane-winged bats could not stop their momentum and crashed into the stone wall. For a time, strange whistling sounds rose one after another, and in the blink of an eye, there were countless more scars on the mountain wall. But it didn't take long for those membrane-winged bats to flap their wings and fly again. Under the gaze of Lu Chen and Atsu, they seemed to be not bound by the canyon at all, or perhaps the smell of blood on Lu Chen's shoulder had made them dizzy, and they desperately wanted to kill and eat these two living creatures. At that moment, a black shadow seemed to cover the sky and the earth, shrouding the snowy ground. Lu Chen and Atsu fell on the snowy ground, and a black shadow covered their eyes. But before they could react, a huge figure suddenly rushed out from behind a mountain wall next to them, and directly crashed into the seemingly terrifying flock of membrane-winged bats. Kacha! It was an ear-piercing sound that carried a trace of terror and cruelty. All the membrane-winged bats seemed to freeze in an instant, and a bloody mouth suddenly appeared in mid-air, biting down from the air, and directly biting 3 membrane-winged bats in its mouth. The sharp teeth closed, and the giant turned around. Black blood flowed out from the gaps between the terrifying giant teeth like water, and slowly dripped down from the mouth of the giant beast. Then, there was a chewing sound coming from the huge shadow, making their hands and feet turn cold. The residual shadow coldly and slowly turned to look at them. The black shadow was like a mountain, completely enveloping them. Chapter 369. The numerous membrane-wing bats, which were still arrogant and majestic just a moment ago, suddenly disappeared. Even if these ferocious demon beasts saw with their own eyes that their companions were suddenly bitten and bleeding by the giant mouth, none of the membrane-wing bats showed any signs of revenge. All the membrane-wing bats seemed to have suddenly turned into stone and were frozen in the air. Those sharp, ear-piercing, bloodthirsty howls also suddenly fell silent at this moment. For a moment, Lu Chen and Atsu, who had fallen on the snow, did not make a sound, nor did the numerous membrane-wing bats in the air. Only the mountain-like majestic black shadow, with its huge mouth, gave off a shuddering and terrifying chewing sound. Crunch, crunch, it was the sound of fangs and bones rubbing against each other. Blood flowed and slowly dripped down. The next moment, all the membrane-wing bats seemed to have woken up from a dream. In an instant, strange cries rang out. They seemed to have suddenly woken up and fluttered their wings to fly into the sky in horror. They seemed to desperately want to leave this place, to get away from the huge black shadow, the further the better. A giant claw descended from the sky, and with a sharp whistling sound, it directly smashed into the group of membrane-wing bats. In an instant, there was a burst of chaotic banging sounds mixed with screams. Another 7 or 8 unlucky membrane-wing bats were smashed by this giant claw, and as if struck by lightning, they fell from the sky one after another. Lu Chen and Atsu saw it clearly from the side. They saw that the membrane-wing bats that fell had broken bones and tendons. Before they fell to the ground, they could see that their bodies were strangely twisted. After falling to the ground, after struggling a few times on the snow, they all became stiff and motionless. It seemed that they had already died. Taking advantage of this opportunity, the remaining membrane-wing bats desperately flapped their wings and flew far away, as if they were fleeing for their lives. One by one, they rushed back to the canyon and dove into the bottomless, dark crevice at the fastest speed, disappearing in the blink of an eye. It was quiet outside the canyon. There was only an unusually tall figure standing in the snow, with its back facing them. At this moment, even Lu Chen and Atsu did not dare to move rashly, for fear that they would suddenly alarm or anger this terrifying monster. At this moment, Lu Chen suddenly felt a chill on his face. He reached out to touch his cheek and found that it was slightly wet. He then looked up and saw that between the blue sky and the snow-capped mountains, there were faint and tiny specks of white floating down. A gust of wind blew from afar, bringing with it a slight chill. It began to snow again. The snow was not heavy, and the wind was very light. It was probably just the beginning. For Lu Chen and Atsu, who were lying on the snowy ground, none of this was important at the moment. Their attention was focused on the gigantic monster in front of them. Lu Chen was a little nervous. For such a monster that could easily scare away those membrane-wing bats and even treat them as food, the strength of Lu Chen and Atsu could not resist it at all. The only thing they could do was probably to see if they could find a chance to escape. Just as he was thinking about how to find a chance to escape, Atsu, who was originally lying beside him, suddenly stood up. Lu Chen was taken aback and quickly reached out to pull Atsu. He had not seen the true face of the monster in front of him, but there was no doubt that the monster was powerful and terrifying. He was a little worried that Atsu was too frightened and would react excessively. If he provoked the monster in advance, he was afraid that it would immediately be a disaster. However, it seemed that Atsu just stood up. The appearance of this black dog also looked a little strange. It seemed to be a little confused, but also a little excited. It stared at the huge shadow, and even its breathing became a lot heavier. Although he was a little surprised by Atsu's performance, seeing that Atsu did not make any drastic moves for the time being, Lu Chen was still relieved. Only then did he turn his attention back to the giant monster. After the membrane-winged bats fled, the giant monster that suddenly appeared turned its head and looked in the direction of the dark crack in the canyon. It did not have any intention to chase after them. After a while, it turned its head, then took 2 steps forward and came to the corpses of the membrane-winged bats that were shot down on the snow. It lowered its head and began to chew. It was also at this moment that Lu Chen finally saw the appearance of the giant monster. He was shocked. The giant monster that appeared in front of him was impressively a giant wolf with an unusually large body. In that canyon, there once appeared a giant wolf with the corpses of humans in its mouth. This paragraph suddenly came to Lu Chen's mind. That was what Hui Yan said to him back then, and it was also the biggest basis for them to determine that there might be a secret path to the northern human territory here. Lu Chen had never seen such a huge monster wolf in his life. Even after Atsu had advanced, it was far inferior to this giant wolf. At best, the body of Atsu was only 1/5 the size of this giant wolf. Its fur was grayish-white, and it had sharp teeth. At this moment, this giant wolf did not seem to notice that there were 2 living creatures in the snow. It just lowered its head and gnawed on the membrane-winged bats that it had shot down. It ate happily, and the sound of crunching that made people's scalp tingle was endless. Seeing the appearance of this giant wolf monster beast, a glimmer of hope suddenly appeared in Lu Chen's heart. He slowly stood up from the snow, and then pulled Atsu, preparing to take this opportunity to try and sneak away quietly. Unexpectedly, Atsu did not move at all, and it did not have the obedience that it usually had towards him. This black dog just stared at the giant wolf. Not only did it not leave, but it even took a step towards the giant wolf. Lu Chen was taken aback and quickly reached out to grab the fur on Atsu's back, not letting it go any further. But just these few actions, coupled with Atsu's subconscious struggle, suddenly seemed to have alarmed the giant wolf monster over there. It suddenly raised its head and looked in the direction of Lu Chen and Atsu. It was a pair of deep green giant eyes, with a cold aura that seemed to be unique to the great snowy mountain. It instantly enveloped Lu Chen and Atsu. A chill made the 2 of them shiver uncontrollably. For a moment, Lu Chen wanted to grab Atsu and run away, but in the end, he forcibly endured it. How to put it, in the face of such a monster, the hope of escaping was really not big. On the contrary, it was better not to further provoke it for the time being. After all, this giant wolf monster did not directly attack them like it did those membrane-winged bats. Although this monster was too terrifying and difficult to predict, it was better to keep quiet. But Atsu seemed to be particularly strange today, different from the past. Under such heavy pressure, not only did it not retreat, but after hesitating for a while, it actually walked towards the monster again. And this time, Atsu did not even stop, and actually walked straight towards it. Lu Chen was stunned. He reached out to grab it, but he could not. At such a dangerous and shocking juncture, he could only watch Atsu walk past. Slowly, with a hint of a test, and at the same time, under the cold gaze of the giant beast, Atsu slowly walked to the feet of the giant wolf. Its body was a little trembling, as if it was still a little afraid, but there was still a stronger force driving it. The giant wolf looked at this little thing coldly, and did not seem to have any intention of making a move. Watching from a distance, Lu Chen, who had no time to stop it, was suddenly shocked. He only felt that Atsu and the giant wolf monster were vaguely similar. Chapter 370. Atsu used to be a stray dog. It met Lu Chen and Yi Xian in the land of chaos and was adopted. Since then, it had been by Lu Chen's side. Yi Xian had always liked it, but for some reason, Atsu was determined to follow Lu Chen, which made Yi Xian very sad. After living together for so many years, they had almost never been separated. Lu Chen naturally knew Atsu's situation like the back of his hand. From the time it was a puppy until it grew into a big dog, Atsu had always been a rustic dog. That was how it got its name. It could be considered a joke that Lu Chen had made fun of it in the past. However, after the Battle of Kunlun Mountain, Atsu, with a combination of all kinds of opportunities, stimulated the ancient bloodline in its body and obtained the opportunity to advance. When Lu Chen saw Atsu again, this puppy had undergone a great change in appearance. It had become more like a powerful black wolf monster. Yes, now, although Lu Chen usually called Atsu as a stupid dog, and so on, even when he was joking, Atsu was already a wolf. At this moment, there was a similarly terrifying and inconceivable giant wolf demonic beast in front of it. Lu Chen even felt that although there was a big difference in size between Atsu and this giant wolf monster, Atsu looked very much like this giant wolf, as if this giant wolf had shrunk by 4 or 5 times. Obviously, Lu Chen was not the only one who felt this way. The two wolves, one big and one small, also seemed to have noticed something. Atsu looked very nervous, and Lu Chen could even see its body trembling slightly on the snowy ground. But in Atsu's heart, there seemed to be another particularly strong emotion driving it all the way to the front of the giant wolf demon beast. It raised its head and looked up at the giant wolf. The giant wolf looked down at it indifferently. After a while, Atsu suddenly let out a howl. It sounded like a wolf's howl, and it reverberated through the mountains. Lu Chen didn't know what Atsu meant by this howl, but he still subconsciously became nervous. This was because he saw that after Atsu mustered up the courage to howl, the giant wolf demon beast finally responded. It suddenly raised one of its front claws. It was the giant claw that had killed 7 or 8 ferocious membrane-wing bats in an instant, and then it slammed down towards Atsu. The wind on the snow-capped mountain seemed to have suddenly turned cold, so cold that it froze one's blood. Lu Chen only felt his scalp go numb, and his heart suddenly jumped. But soon, he found something unusual. The giant wolf demon beast's claws were not fast. For a giant beast like it, it could even be said to be gentle. Lu Chen abruptly stopped his steps and stared at the giant beast in front of him. It was at this moment, following the movement of the giant wolf demon beast, Lu Chen suddenly discovered some details that he hadn't noticed before. This giant wolf demon beast was undoubtedly terrifying and powerful, but at this moment, Lu Chen discovered that there were wounds on the giant wolf's body. The wounds were very deep, and the injuries were very serious. There were even more than one wound. Although this giant wolf demon beast didn't seem to care about the injuries on its body, Lu Chen quickly thought of the big fight that he had experienced not long ago. To be precise, it was last night in that canyon, where he was forced to hide in the seed tree hole. Just as Lu Chen's expression changed slightly, the wolf's claws in the air had already fallen and landed on the top of Atsu's head. Atsu lowered its head and body, seemingly making a submissive posture. The giant wolf's claws did not show the terrifying power that it had before to directly kill it. Instead, after a slight pause, it actually gently touched the top of Atsu's head twice. A low and heavy voice suddenly echoed in this snow-capped mountain. "You are my son." The mountains were silent, and the snow seemed to be a little stronger. There was no one else here except for Lu Chen. There were only 2 wolves in front of him. But this heavy voice also clearly echoed in Lu Chen's ears, causing him to be a little confused for a moment. But very soon, he came to his senses and looked at the giant wolf demon beast with a stunned expression. After Atsu heard this, he became visibly excited. He barked a few times at the giant wolf monstrous beast. His body kept twisting, and from time to time, he would rub his head against the giant wolf monstrous beast, expressing his obvious affection. Looking at the strange behavior of Atsu, Lu Chen instantly thought of the reason for this matter. When he first saw Atsu, he judged that this little demon beast might have an extraordinary origin, and it was even likely to be a descendant of the legendary snow wolf demon beast of the Great Snowy Mountain. The snow wolf, also known as the Heavenly Wolf, was one of the most powerful and terrifying demon beasts in the ancient times, and had unimaginable power. But for some reason unknown to the human race, this powerful demon beast had never appeared in the world in the history of the human race, but its legend had always existed. Looking at the giant wolf demon beast in front of him, Lu Chen took a deep breath. No wonder it could fight head-on with the King of Darkness in the underground abyss. They were indeed powerful creatures that defied the natural order. As for Atsu, since it was a descendant of the Heavenly Wolf and had wandered to the chaotic lands, Lu Chen did not know about it. But according to the legend, the Heavenly Wolf was a loner and did not care about having children. Perhaps even the Heavenly Wolf itself did not know about the existence of Atsu. In short, Atsu seemed to be extremely excited. When the Heavenly Wolf saw one of its children suddenly appear in front of it, it seemed to be in a good mood. After a while, it turned its gaze to look at Lu Chen. Lu Chen's heart skipped a beat, but before he or the Heavenly Wolf could react, Atsu had already jumped in between them, stopped Lu Chen, and barked at the Heavenly Wolf. After listening for a while, the Heavenly Wolf's originally cold gaze softened. It retracted its gaze, opened and closed its mouth, and a deep and heavy voice once again came from its mouth. "Since you said so, I'll spare his life. Human, go down the mountain yourself." Lu Chen was shocked, and his heart was at a loss for a moment. But he knew that this was probably the best outcome for him. But at this moment, Atsu suddenly jumped up again, barked repeatedly, and ran back to Lu Chen's side. The Heavenly Wolf's voice suddenly carried a trace of anger, and said, "You are a descendant of the Heavenly Wolf, why are you following a human?" After a pause, it said again, "Stay in this great snow mountain and stay by my side for a few years. I will naturally teach you various skills so that you can achieve something in the future." However, Atsu just shook its head, and its expression was extremely firm. The intimacy it had when it first saw the Heavenly Wolf had disappeared at this moment. Lu Chen was surprised and a little touched. For a moment, he did not know what to say, but he looked at the Heavenly Wolf with some worry, afraid that it would get angry. However, the Heavenly Wolf just stared at Atsu, and after a long while, it shook its head, seemingly a little helpless, and said in a low voice, "Sure enough, our Heavenly Wolf bloodline is." It did not continue speaking, but took a step and walked towards Lu Chen. The figure, which was as tall as a mountain, walked in front of Lu Chen in a few strides, and a terrible and terrifying pressure instantly shrouded Lu Chen, and the huge wolf's head also slowly lowered and fell in front of Lu Chen. Its sharp and huge fangs were very close to him, and he could even see his own reflection in the terrifying wolf's eyes. But after taking a deep breath, Lu Chen still clenched his teeth and did not retreat. Lu Chen looked straight at the Heavenly Wolf, and after looking at it for a while, the Heavenly Wolf suddenly said, "It wants to go with you." Lu Chen nodded, and said, "I know, I'm very happy." The Heavenly Wolf snorted coldly, looked at him, and said, "There are countless dangers in front of the Great Snow Mountain. Even if you pass the Abyss Canyon, you can't get out." Lu Chen was silent for a moment, and said, "Since we have come this far, we still have to try to know." The Heavenly Wolf said indifferently, "I can help you pass, even if it is for my son, but you are not, so you have to promise to do something for me." Lu Chen's spirit was lifted, and he said, "What is it?" The Heavenly Wolf said, "Have you heard of a person called Taihu?" Chapter 371. Taihu. Lu Chen was shocked. He was not unfamiliar with this name as he had heard of it before. In fact, in the vast land of the Divine Continent, at least in the cultivation world, there were not many cultivators who did not know of this name. He was one of the 6 divine transformation stage perfected lords of the Alliance of True Immortals, the famous and influential perfected Lord Ironpot. Who didn't know him? However, after a moment of silence, Lu Chen said, "There are hundreds of millions of people in the Divine Continent. There are countless people with the same name. If we only rely on this name, I'm afraid I can't determine which one is the person you are looking for." Tian Lang nodded, but his expression remained the same. He said, "That person's cultivation is extremely high. he was able to enter the Great Snow Mountain and meet me. In terms of cultivation level, he is already at the peak of the human race. So, can you find that person? Lu Chen exhaled softly, then nodded with a slightly serious expression. Since Sirius had already said it to this extent, it couldn't be anyone else. It had to be that supreme Tai who from the true Immortal Alliance. However, he did not expect that in the deepest part of the chaotic land, in the Great Snow Mountain, which was known as one of the most dangerous places in the world, Tai Hu Lord would actually be related to the ancient beast here. For some reason, Lu Chen faintly felt that this matter was not normal. However, he could not think of too many things at the moment. He could only say to Tian Lang, if that's the case, I already know who that person is. What do you want me to do? Please tell me. Tian Lang did not speak immediately. Instead, he stared at Lu Chen. After a moment, he said, you guys follow me first. After that, he turned around and walked towards the north. Lu Chen and Atsu looked at each other and followed. It was just that the Great Snowy Mountain was extremely steep, and since ancient times, there had been no signs of human habitation, so there were no roads to speak of. Although Lu Chen could see that the ancient celestial wolf had slowed down, he still couldn't catch up. However, at this moment, the benefits of raising a dog for 1,000 days could be seen. Atsu very consciously came over and barked at Lu Chen. It looked as if it was disgusted. Then, Lu Chen could only laugh dryly and climb onto Atsu's back. Then, Atsu started to run. It was at this moment that Lu Chen finally understood why this fellow could run in a place like the Great Snow Mountain as if it was running on flat ground. It seemed like it had inherited some of its father's powerful ancient bloodline. In the midst of this, Tian Lang turned around to take a look. When it saw Atsu carrying Lu Chen on its back, it paused for a moment as if it was unhappy. However, when it saw Atsu's cheerful and honest look, it did not show any signs of being forced. In the end, Tian Lang could only silently shake its head and continue to run forward. With Atsu as a means of transportation, their speed instantly increased by several folds. Later on, even Sirius quickened his pace. 2 wolves, one big and one small, sprinted through the Great Snowy Mountain range. Even though the snow falling from the sky gradually became heavier, it could not stop their strong and fast bodies that were as fast as lightning. There were dangers everywhere in the Great Snow Mountain, but they were safe and sound along the way. Naturally, this was not because Lu Chen and the others were too lucky. The main reason was basically the existence of Tian Lang, which was more ferocious and more powerful than all the hidden beasts around them. After running for a long time, passing countless peaks, braving the wind and snow, they finally came to the foot of a big mountain. Lu Chen soon found a huge cave at the foot of the mountain. Tian Lang led him and Atsu into the cave. A cave that could accommodate the hill-like body of Tian Lang was naturally huge for Lu Chen. Before he entered the cave, he was already prepared in his heart. He thought that this kind of fierce beast's lair would most likely have piles of bones piled up like a mountain. The terrifying scene would make one's scalp numb. As for the stench, it was needless to say. Who knew that after he entered the cave, he was shocked. This huge lair of Tian Lang was unusually clean and tidy. There was no trace of the piles of bones that he imagined, and there was nothing terrifying to be afraid of. Well, except for the giant beast itself. After staying in the cave for a long time, Lu Chen suddenly realized that he didn't smell the stench that most wild beasts had in their caves. This huge cavern was actually just a huge cavern, and there were no other small paths. After Sirius arrived, he laid down in the middle of the cavern and signaled for Lu Chen to rest in a corner of the cavern. Then, he called Atsu over. What Tian Lang said to Atsu, Lu Chen did not hear at all. Perhaps there was a special way of communication between wolves, or perhaps, Tian Lang was too powerful. Lu Chen did not know if Tian Lang cast a spell to hinder his hearing. In short, Lu Chen did not hear anything for the whole day. He just watched Atsu stay beside Tian Lang, quietly listening to something. There were a few times when Tian Lang stretched out a front paw to gently touch Atsu's head and body. When Lu Chen saw that action, he felt that it really seemed like a kind of action between father and son. After the initial indifference, as the communication increased, Tianlang seemed to begin to become closer to Atsu. After a night like this, the snow outside became heavier and heavier. Later, it finally became a snowstorm that existed in the Great Snow Mountain. However, in this lair of Tianlang, the snow seemed to be a very distant thing for Lu Qin. Lu Qin spent a very peaceful night here. At some point in the middle of the night, Lu Qin suddenly woke up from his deep sleep. Then, he saw a strange rainbow light appear in what should have been a pitch-black cave. Atu lay quietly beside Sirius, while Sirius stared at him, one of its front paws resting on Atu's head. The dazzling rainbow light was emitted from the forehead where they touched, then turned into a dreamy radiance, surrounding Atsu's entire body in the light. From Lu Chen's point of view, Atsu's entire body seemed to be glowing, as if something in its body had been awakened. It began to bloom and emit power. From a distance, he could even hear the bones in Atsu's body creaking and shaking non-stop. For some reason, although Lu Qin could not see what Tianlang was doing to Atsu, for no reason, a few words such as rebirth and change the meridians and marrow suddenly emerged in his mind. He lay in the darkness and quietly watched this strange scene. Then, at some point, he quietly fell asleep again. When he opened his eyes at dawn, he saw Atsu. He did not know when the black dog had returned to his side. Perhaps it was because they had been relying on each other for so many years that it had become a habit. Atu still habitually nestled his head against his body. His body was very warm. Lu Qin smiled and reached out to pat its head. Tianlang let them stay in this cave for 3 days. During this period, Tianlang would perform that strange trick on Atsu every night. As for the effect, Lu Qin could not tell for the time being. At least, Atsu did not seem to have changed significantly. On the 4th day, Tianlang finally seemed to be a little tired and let them leave. This time, Tianlang directly led the two of them out of the Great Snowy Mountain and arrived at the border between the Great Snowy Mountain and the Land of Chaos. It was also here that Lu Qin finally heard what Tianlang told him. "Go find the person called Iron Pot and tell him," Tianlang said to Lu Qin, "it's time to return the leaf that he borrowed back then." Chapter 372. Do you know what leaf is? After descending from the Great Snow Mountain, Lu Qin watched as the ancient giant beast turned around and disappeared into the vast snowy mountains, leaving only Atu and Lu Qin standing at the foot of the mountain. Lu Qin asked Atu. Atsu shook its head, indicating that it knew nothing about it. Lu Qin felt a little helpless, so he turned around and walked forward. Atsu followed beside him. The snowstorm around them was getting weaker and weaker. The white faded away and the greenery gradually flourished. Unknowingly, they seemed to have walked into another world. Recalling the past, recalling the inexplicable days spent in the southern wilderness, Lu Qin could only sigh and sigh with emotion. However, when the flourishing scenes of life reappeared before his eyes, the lush greenery and vibrant flora and fauna that were rarely seen in the southern wilderness, even though they were still in the dangerous depths of the Land of Chaos, Lu Qin still felt a sense of joy as though he was a wanderer who had returned home. For many years, he had never felt such a feeling, but at this time, he unexpectedly experienced it. Perhaps no matter what, as a human, he could not give up the yearning in his heart. No matter how good the southern Xinjiang wilderness was, it could not keep his heart. This time, the place they came out from was, of course, not the place that Lu Qin and Atsu had come to a few years ago. Back then, they were forced to jump into the Longchuan River and were finally washed to the southern Xinjiang wilderness by the river water. This time, it was mostly thanks to Atsu's cheap giant beast father. In any case, Lu Qin felt that Sirius probably did not want a rare descendant to die in the Land of Chaos. Therefore, after Sirius brought them out of the Great Snowy Mountain, they arrived at a place that they had never been to or heard of before. It looked like a green grassland with many hills and was full of vitality. However, the monsters that lived here were obviously more gentle. There were rarely any ferocious and terrifying monsters that gave people headaches. Occasionally, 1 or 2 aggressive monsters would appear, but Lu Chen and Atsu managed to deal with them one by one. Perhaps this was the shortcut? However, as he walked through this unknown grassland, Lu Chen soon discovered something unusual about Atsu. The most obvious thing was that the big dog's appetite had once again skyrocketed. Atsu was desperately eating, and it only ate the flesh and blood of demonic beasts. Ordinary beasts and even weaker demonic beasts were obviously not worthy of its attention. Lu Chen observed along the way. It seemed that the more powerful and vigorous the demonic beasts were, the more interested this big black dog was. Every day, Atsu was in a state of hunger. It always wanted to eat more, and as it ate crazily, the black dog became fiercer and fiercer. Atsu was getting stronger and stronger. Lu Chen clearly felt this. He saw with his own eyes that a large number of monsters on this grassland, from weak to strong, from small to large, were slowly entering the menu of Atsu, and then in turn, stimulating Atsu to become stronger. The strength of this dog was growing by leaps and bounds. Lu Chen had never seen any kind of monster that could have such a terrifying growth. Perhaps this was the power of the ancient bloodline? Then, Lu Chen quickly thought of the strange things that he secretly saw Sirius doing to Atsu during those nights in the den of Sirius, and the dazzling and swaying rainbow light around Atsu. Would this dog grow into a giant beast like Sirius in the future? Lu Chen couldn't help but think so. This terrifying rate of growth continued for 7 days. It wasn't until the two of them had walked across the wide grassland that Atsu's seemingly bottomless appetite finally began to slow down. It then told Lu Chen the reason why it had become docile. It was probably because it had eaten too much recently, so it was temporarily on an empty stomach and stopped hunting those unlucky demon beasts for no good reason. Lu Chen looked back at the road they came from. Around the road that passed through the vibrant grassland, there were probably countless monsters that had fallen. Atsu was 2 times fatter than when it first came down from the snowy mountain. Now, it was already a real huge black wolf. Just by standing, Atsu's body had already exceeded Lu Chen's head. As it walked, it exuded an awe-inspiring aura. That magnificent aura made it look like the king of the grassland. But it was no wonder. Along the way, almost all the big and small demonic beasts on the prairie had been harmed by Atsu and Lu Chen. Even if there were some particularly powerful ones that Atsu couldn't defeat for the time being, they were often defeated by Lu Chen, who was helping the tyrant with all kinds of cunning tricks, and became Atsu's tonic. Then, on the 7th day, they walked to the other side of the grassland. Immediately, they saw a large river appear in their field of vision. The Dragon River. At last they saw the river again. The Dragon River was the dividing line between the most dangerous inner region and the central region of the Land of Chaos. As long as they crossed this river and continued north, they would most likely encounter humans like Lu Chen once they reached the central region of the Land of Chaos. Of course, the people they met might not necessarily be their friends. However, Lu Chen was still very happy and his mood quickly improved. As he stood by the riverbank and observed the situation of the Dragon River, he even had the mood to ask Atsu, who was standing beside him, "You're finally back. After crossing the river, do you have a destination in mind?" This time, Atsu reacted quickly. It barked at Lu Chen and drew a few lines on the ground with its paw. At first, Lu Chen couldn't help but laugh. He scolded Atsu, "I don't really understand what you're saying. I was wondering when you would be able to cultivate to the level of that Sirius and imitate our human language. Of course, it would not be easy to reach the level of Sky Wolf's ability to speak human language. In fact, it was very likely that this ability could only be achieved by reaching the peak of the demon beasts. Naturally, Atsu was still far from it. However, when Lu Chen's gaze swept across the lines that Atsu had drawn on the ground, he found it funny at first. However, his smile suddenly froze as if he had seen something under Atsu's paw. After a while, Atsu retracted its front paw and took a few steps back. Lu Chen slowly walked over and squatted on the ground. He looked at the messy lines on the ground. After a while, he reached out a hand and gently drew on the soil. Some were unnecessary lines, some were mistakes made by Atsu due to its inexperience, and some were not very obvious. However, as his fingers moved, a simple drawing gradually appeared on the ground. The drawing was very simple. It was so simple that one could barely see the uneven and crooked lines formed by a few strokes. It looked like an undulating mountain range. Lu Chen looked at it silently for a while and then raised his head. Atsu's head was not far in front of him, and it was also staring at him. Lu Chen asked, "Do you want to go back to Kunlun Mountain first?" Atsu nodded. Lu Chen said, "Why do we go back? That place no longer welcomes us." His voice suddenly stopped, and then there seemed to be a gloomy expression on his face. He looked at Atsu and sighed softly. "So, you want to go back and see her again?" Lu Chen asked softly. Atsu nodded and barked, "Woof." Chapter 373. Lu Chen pondered for a long time on the southern bank of the Longchuan River. In the end, he did not choose to return to Kunlun Mountain. Of course, he did not forget Yi Xian. She was a young girl with a smile as bright and warm as the sun. Even after so many years, her voice and smile could not be erased from his heart. However, it was not good to return to Kunlun Mountain. During that full moon night, many things happened. Lu Chen killed the young master of the Su family, Sumo. After his identity was exposed, he was hunted down by both the righteous and evil sections. If he returned, he would easily alert his old enemies. As for Yi Xian, she had died that day. After Lu Chen avenged her, he had fled. It was probably the Yi family who helped her with her funeral arrangements. If he went back to look for her now, he would not even know where her grave was. He would have to secretly pry for her whereabouts. This was another matter that could easily alert others. However, the most important part of the matter was not this. Up until now, Lu Chen still couldn't figure out who that damned Baldy was, and he couldn't understand him. That person held a high position as a supreme, and his words carried enormous weight in the Kunlun Mountains and the surrounding areas. It could be said that he was already a supreme existence in a dignified and prestigious sect. However, at this point, Lu Chen still did not dare to say that he could completely trust him. Even when he suddenly recalled his childhood in the southern wilderness, whenever he returned to the chaotic lands and approached the human race, he would instinctively be wary of this true monarch Tianlan. The damned Baldy's heart was as deep as the ocean, and his cultivation was frighteningly high. As for his unpredictable methods, there was no need to mention anything else. At the very least, Lu Chen himself was taught by him. There was no one else in this world who knew more about the Baldy than Lu Chen. If possible, he would not want to be enemies with the Baldy. However, he did not know what Baldy thought of him now. Perhaps the greatest sorrow of being in the shadow business was that it was difficult to trust someone completely. Lu Chen made his decision and informed Atsu. Of course, he couldn't explain it in such detail to a dog, so he tried to simplify it as much as possible. He said to Atsu, "There's no hurry with Kunlun Mountain. Instead, let's go to the immortal city and help him with the things that your cheap father told us to do." Woof, Atsu didn't seem to be very insistent. Perhaps for the sake of Lu Chen, he gave him some face. He mumbled a few words and followed him. Since the goal was set, the Longchuan River in front of him became the biggest problem to overcome. Neither Lu Chen nor Atsu had forgotten the scene of falling into the river, and neither of them wanted to try it again. However, the Longchuan River flowed right in front of them, with no end in sight. Lu Chen stood by the river and was at a loss of what to do. This is going to be a bit troublesome. Lu Chen muttered to himself with a frown. His eyes were already scanning the surrounding terrain, especially the areas with trees. He was already thinking if he could build a simple boat or raft to float across the water. However, if this section of the Longchuan River did indeed have some powerful and terrifying river beasts, once they were discovered, the small boats, wooden rafts, and the like would be no different from papier-mâché once they were discovered. At that time, if they fell into the river again, the same thing would probably happen again. For many years, the deeper the land of chaos went, the fewer cultivators who could reach this place. Most of those who could cross the Longchuan River were perfected cultivators in the Yuanying realm. At such a high cultivation level, flying was a remarkable ability that most people could master. Naturally, they would not be as troubled as Lu Chen and Atsu. Just as Lu Chen's head was aching, and he was deep in thought, Atsu walked up to him from the side. He looked at Lu Chen, and there was a hint of disdain in his eyes. Lu Chen saw it and immediately became angry. He said, "What are you looking at? It's not like you don't know what's under the Longchuan River. Our cultivation level is not high enough, so it's very difficult to cross." Atsu snorted and even wagged its tail. It did not seem to mind Lu Chen's words at all. Instead, it looked a little proud. Lu Chen was a little puzzled. He stared at the big black dog that was slightly taller than him and said, "Why, you seem to disagree?" Atsu barked twice and walked straight to the Longchuan River. Lu Chen watched it walk all the way to the riverside. Then, he saw the black dog look up at the sky. Its aura suddenly became especially imposing and arrogant. Suddenly, it roared twice. Woof! Woof! The dog's barking spread far and wide, drifting on the wide surface of the Longchuan River. It was loud, but the feedback was not loud. Lu Chen watched from the side for a long time, only to see that the surface of the river was calm and there was no reaction. Lu Chen walked to Atsu's side and patted the dazed Atsu. He said with a smile, "Although I don't know what you want to do, it seems that you did not succeed." Atsu looked angry, but also a little confused. At this moment, it seemed to have doubts about its own intelligence. It squatted by the river and stared at the river for a long time. All of a sudden, the black dog jumped up as if it had thought of something, and Lu Chen, who was standing beside it, jumped in fright. Atsu barked twice at the Longchuan River, but this time, the sound was much shorter. Then, it suddenly spat out something from its mouth. Lu Chen saw it clearly and realized that it seemed to be a golden stone the size of half a fist. The golden stone fell to the ground and rolled a few times before falling into the Longchuan River. Suddenly, there was a flash of golden light, and the water bubbled. The golden stone disappeared into the depths of the river in the blink of an eye. Then, Atsu solemnly barked a few times at the Longchuan River like before. The Longchuan River seemed to be so calm and did not seem to have any reaction. Lu Chen walked to Atsu's side and touched the somewhat dazed dog's head. He smiled and said, "What is that stone? Where did it come from?" Atsu looked very stunned. After a while, it turned around and barked in the direction it came from. Lu Chen thought for a while and said, "Did Sirius give it to you?" Atsu nodded. Lu Chen spread his hands and didn't know what to say for a moment. He thought to himself, perhaps the thing that Heavenly Wolf gave its son was also a treasure? At least when the golden stone was revealed for a short period of time, it looked quite magnificent. However, in the blink of an eye, it was thrown into the Longchuan River. He wondered what expression Sirius would have if he knew what had happened today. While the two of them were in a daze by the riverbank, a majestic aura suddenly came from the river. Before Lu Chen and Atsu could react, a huge tentacle suddenly broke out of the river and landed with a loud bang. It brought with it a large wave and directly gushed over. Lu Chen and Atsu's reactions were not slow. When they saw the wave rise, they hurriedly jumped away, avoiding the fate of being drenched. However, very soon, their eyes were fixed on the huge creature that suddenly appeared in the river. The tentacle, which was thicker than their bodies and several tens of feet long, was actually just one of the tentacles of the giant beast in the river. The part of the tentacle that was exposed above the water looked like an incomparably huge octopus. Its two huge black eyes stared down at the two ants on the riverbank from above. The huge creature looked at Lu Chen and then at Atsu. After a while, a hoarse and ear-piercing voice suddenly echoed in their ears. "Wolf cub, did your perverted father ask you to find me?" Chapter 374. Lu Chen stared at the gigantic creature that had suddenly emerged from the Dragon River. He wasn't too surprised. Perhaps it was because he had been in the Bedlam lands for a long time, especially this time. He had seen too many strange creatures and beasts that he had never seen before. He was a little numb to them. He even had the leisure to turn around to look at Atu, only to see that the black dog seemed to be startled as well, and was a little dumbfounded. After a while, the giant octopus monster spoke impatiently in their ears again. At the same time, a giant tentacle reached out from the river. It was holding the golden stone that Atsu had thrown into the river. Atu immediately reacted and hurriedly nodded his head. The giant octopus monster snorted coldly. This time, its voice was like thunder, causing their ears to buzz. The octopus said unhappily, "It's just a small favor. You wolves are so stingy. It's been a few thousand years and you still want to collect your debt." Lu Chen and Atu looked at each other in dismay. Lu Chen gave Atu a look with a questioning look in his eyes, but Atu immediately shook his head with an expression that said, "I don't know what happened to Father Heavenly Wolf back then either." The giant octopus looked a little indignant, but after complaining for a while, it slammed its tentacles into the water a few times, stirring up a big splash. Then, it said to Atu as if it had accepted its fate, "Tell me, what do you want me to do for you?" As it spoke, it suddenly glared at them and said, "There's only one thing. You are not allowed to leave the Longchuan River. Otherwise, I won't pay for it." Lu Chen and Atsu looked at each other. After a while, they said in unison. "Oh, no," they said it in unison, but they pointed at the opposite bank of the Longchuan River. "Cross the river, we want to cross the river." Woof 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 woof. About an hour later, when they came down from the giant octopus, they had already reached the opposite bank of the Longchuan River. To them, the Longchuan River was extremely difficult and dangerous. But to this giant octopus, crossing it was as easy as taking a few steps at home. The octopus seemed to be in a good mood. It was probably relieved that a promise from years ago had been fulfilled in such a relaxed manner. It didn't even bother to explain anything to these two ants. After sending them to the north bank of the Longchuan River, it turned around and dived back into the river, disappearing in the blink of an eye. Lu Chen looked at the vast river and was amazed for a moment. He wondered what kind of vast underwater world it was that could accommodate so many giant beasts and all kinds of incredible creatures. At this time, Atu called out from beside him. Lu Chen turned around and saw Atu looking at him with a smug look on his face. It was as if he was asking for praise from someone who didn't live up to his expectations. Lu Chen rolled his eyes and said unhappily, "I know, it's all thanks to you this time. It's good to have a good father." "Woof," Atsu responded. After crossing the Dragon River, they were still within the boundaries of the disorienting lands. However, it was obvious that they were in the outer regions. The danger level of the various hidden monsters had decreased significantly. Lu Chen and Atu had a much easier time dealing with them. At this time, Atu's soaring strength had gradually shown itself. Along the way, most of the time, it was not them who avoided or resisted the demon beasts. Instead, it was Atu who would often find trouble with the demon beasts. From time to time, he would bring back one or two prey to add to his meal. Lu Chen's strength had also improved greatly. However, his situation was very special. It could be said that he was different from most cultivators in the human cultivation world. The traditional foundation establishment, Jin Dan, and Yuanying realms didn't seem to have any meaning for him. At that moment, Lu Chen's skills and cultivation base were more similar to the shaman priests of the berserkers in the south. With black fire as his foundation, he had also learned quite a few strange and unfathomable shaman arts over the past few years. According to his own speculation, with his current strength, there was no doubt that he could defeat the foundation establishment cultivators of the human race. Even if he were to fight against Jin Dan Friar, he should be able to put up a fight. However, if it was a powerful cultivator of the Yuanying realm, Lu Chen still had some doubts. After thinking about it, those Yuanying spiritual masters were all powerful cultivators. How could it be so easy to catch up to them? At the same time, Lu Chen also thought of something that he had noticed before. The reversed aura of the 5 elements in the disorienting land didn't seem to have much effect on him anymore. This was especially obvious when he came over from the Great Snow Mountain. Lu Chen wasn't sure why, but he thought that it was probably related to the great increase in the power of the black flame in his body during this trip to the southern border. 1 man and 1 dog headed north. On the second day after they left the Longchuan River, they met a person. Yes, a human cultivator adventurer. That was the first person that Lu Chen and Atsu had seen in a few years. At that moment, it was hard to describe Lu Chen's feelings. He couldn't help but stare at the person in front of him for a long time. Atsu also looked very excited. It jumped and roared, as if it was celebrating. After all, it had lived among the human race for many years. In the past, it had seen people like Lu Chen. At this moment, it probably felt a sense of familiarity. However, this scared the cultivator half to death. The land of chaos was fraught with danger. Aside from the various hidden dangers, there were also ferocious demonic beasts that roamed about. There was also the possibility of people plotting and killing each other. Thus, when he saw that the person opposite him was staring at him with a malicious intent, and the incomparably large black wolf demonic beast next to him was roaring angrily with a menacing aura, as if it wanted to devour someone, the cultivator screamed, turned around, and ran away. He ran very fast. Lu Chen and Atu were left behind, their faces filled with shock. After that, Lu Chen and Atsu became more careful and restrained. After the initial excitement and joy, they quickly calmed down. This was the disorienting lands. Even the human race could be ruthless enemies here. Although it felt very dangerous, Lu Chen didn't feel uncomfortable. On the contrary, he actually felt a sense of familiarity. If it wasn't for the fact that he had always been calm and couldn't do something like, "I'm back," to the mountains and forests like a fool, he might have sighed. Now that his cultivation was high and he was strong, the path that was difficult and dangerous in the past suddenly felt easy. They walked out of the disorienting land safely and smoothly. On the 6th day, they finally reached the edge of the disorienting land and left this chaotic land. Of course, the place they came out from was not the Crescent City from back then. In fact, in order to avoid people's eyes and ears, Lu Chen had specially chosen a remote exit to leave. On the way, he asked the locals for a bit and finally found out their approximate location. They were far away from the western continent where Kunlun Mountain was located, but they were much closer to the immortal city towards the central plains. Could this be heaven's will? Lu Chen said casually to Atsu, then continued north. Everything seemed to be going to be like this, but as they walked, Lu Chen's footsteps suddenly slowed down. Atsu looked at Lu Chen suspiciously, only to see Lu Chen's expression suddenly become a little strange. He seemed to have thought of something, a little lost, but also a little yearning. After a moment, the man suddenly laughed, then said to Atsu, "I thought of something. On the way to the immortal city, if we make a slight turn, we will actually pass by a place where I used to live. Do you want to go take a look with me?" Woof. Lu Chen glanced towards a certain direction in the distance and said, "Are you asking about that place?" "Yes, it's a small village in the mountains, extremely poor, but it's a very quiet and beautiful place." As he said that, he smiled and said, "At the foot of T Mountain, Qingshidang village." Chapter 375. Lu Chen had lived in Qingshidang village for 10 whole years. During that period of time, he was like an ordinary person, living an ordinary life. He had his own joys and sorrows, and he experienced or even seemed to possess the life of an ordinary person. But sometimes, in some unknown place, he seemed to be a cold and lonely shadow, standing alone in a dark corner, looking at the world coldly. There was a huge gap between him and the ordinary people in the village, and he could never blend in. Therefore, when Lu Chen once again saw the tall T Mountain from afar and the village entrance at the foot of the mountain, he saw the fertile farmlands on both sides of the flat road, and there were people planting seedlings inside. He was in a trance for a moment, feeling as if he had turned back into the idle, joking, and scolding Lu Chen in the village. He composed himself, then patted Atsu beside him, pointed to the tea mountain in the distance, and said, "You're too big now. Not only will you scare people easily when you enter the village, you'll also attract unnecessary trouble. Go around the side and play on the mountain. I'll go to the dragon lake at the top of the mountain to find you later." Atsu looked at him, but did not show any emotion. After wagging its tail, it ran off on its own. The surrounding mountains were undulating, and very soon, Atsu's figure disappeared into the wilderness. Seeing that Atsu had left, Lu Chen turned and walked towards the entrance of Qingshitang village. The closer he got, the clearer the surrounding scenery became. Just like what he remembered, there were not many people on the road outside the village. Other than the occasional traveling merchants, he remembered that the busiest time of the month was probably when the people from the nearby Thousand Autumns sect came to purchase spiritual materials. The villagers who worked in the farmlands rarely raised their heads to look. Occasionally, some of them would look in Lu Chen's direction, but there was no emotion in their eyes. Instead, it was a look of numbness to life, to the world, and to their own fate. Lu Chen's gaze swept across the farmlands and the working people on both sides of the road, and then he walked over. He had lived here for 10 years, and was used to this scene very early on. In fact, the way these working people looked was the impression he had of most people in Qingshitang village. For the so-called illusory hope of becoming an immortal, they spent their entire lives risking their lives. They worked hard to accumulate wealth and went to gamble once. Then, they lost everything, including all their money and their lives. In these 10 years, he had seen too many people like this. In Lu Chen's memory, the scenery in this village was fresh and beautiful, but the color of the people in this village was gray. However, Lu Chen did not belittle or look down on these ordinary people, because in those 10 years, he had always been one of them, although at that time, he could only be regarded as a somewhat cynical and unusual person. Who did not want to become an immortal? Who did not want to go straight to the top and be the center of attention? The dreams of ants wanting to soar high were never wrong, the only wrong was that they were ultimately powerless against fate. It was like a chasm in front of them that was difficult to cross, like a flight of stairs that was difficult to climb. They were angry, in pain, roaring, then sad, disappointed, but they refused to give up, and they would not despair. Thus, day after day, year after year, they became numb to the passage of time. Lu Chen walked into the village, and at that moment, he suddenly felt as if he had walked into the past. Everything in front of him seemed to be the same as before, and the Qingshitang village in front of him was also the peaceful little mountain village of the past. His gaze involuntarily looked in a certain direction. In those 10 long years, in his memory, most of the people in the village were gray in color, but he still remembered that there was once a beautiful woman, who was a unique and beautiful scenery in his memory. She was Ding Dang, that passionate woman. She was still young, and at that time, she had not completely lost hope in life. In that period of time, she seemed to be the only shining light in this village. Until he suppressed the pain of his memories, Lu Chen began to look around the situation. The village was obviously livelier than the outside of the village. There were more people coming and going, and quite a few people noticed Lu Chen walking into the village. However, no one went up to ask or do anything else. The people here seemed to be wary of outsiders. What made Lu Chen a little surprised was that when he looked around, he could still vaguely recognize a few familiar faces in the crowd, but the villagers who originally lived here did not seem to recognize him. It was as if Lu Chen had never lived here before, as if Lu Chen had been erased from their memories. Lu Chen was a little surprised, but of course it was impossible for him to go up and grab these villagers, and then go and greet them, pretending to be reunited after a long time, as if he was reunited with his family. In fact, when he was in this village, other than Old Ma, Ding Dang, and a few others who were familiar with him, the others were at most acquaintances who nodded at him. Their relationship was very ordinary. It was probably because of this that those people forgot about him very quickly. Lu Chen shook his head, and did not pay attention to these people, and walked along the familiar bluestone path. On the side of the stone road was the clear stream. After so many years, the stream was still so clear that the bottom could be seen, and the pebbles and fish could be seen clearly. It was exactly the same as in his memory. The mountain breeze blew down from the distant mountains, causing layers of ripples on the clear stream. On the two sides of the stream, the bamboo and peach blossoms set off each other, creating a beautiful scene. The scene in front of him suddenly told Lu Chen that it was spring in this world again. Lu Chen smiled, and his mood suddenly became much better. Walking on the stone road, he watched the peach blossoms bloom, and the petals fluttered in the wind. It was as if he could vaguely see that day, the beautiful woman standing under the peach blossom tree. She seemed to still have a smile on her face, raising her hand and waving it at him. It was the most enchanting and beautiful picture scroll in ordinary life. Lu Chen walked past the peach tree, stretched out his hand, and broke off a peach branch from the tree. A faint fragrance greeted him. The peach blossoms bloomed like a smiling face, as if laughing at his busy and dreamy life in the world. Lu Chen grinned, smiled at the peach blossom in his hand, and said softly, "You should be relaxed now, right? Wait for me, I'll go see you later." With that, he casually put the peach blossom in his arms, and then walked away. Unknowingly, he arrived at the fork in the road, and a familiar big locust tree appeared in front of him, growing next to the clear water stream. Lu Chen looked over, and subconsciously looked at the big rock by the shore under the tree. In his memory, every day, there would be an old fisherman with the surname Yu sitting here fishing. But on this day, although the weather was good, the rock under the tree was empty. Lu Chen was stunned, stood there for a while, and then silently turned around and walked away. Walking along the road into the village, he soon saw the most familiar house in his memory. Nothing had changed here. That house was still a tavern. Even the word, wine, written on the door seemed to be the same as it was in the past. Everything was the same as in his memory, as if he had never left. Lu Chen was a little surprised, and then smiled. He thought to himself, the business opened by old Ma is destined to lose money, and there is really someone who will take over and continue to open the pub? Are they stupid? However, looking at the flag with the word, wine, on it, he suddenly felt like drinking. So, he strode over. Countless memories of the past surged into his mind, and he felt a burst of warmth in his heart, although he didn't know where fatty old Ma was now. With this thought in his mind, he stepped in, and at the same time said, "Boss, give me 2 jugs of wine." His voice suddenly stopped, and he stood at the door of the pub, with a stunned expression on his face, and looked at the counter in the pub. He saw that behind the counter, a fat man turned around with some difficulty, looked at Lu Chen, curled his lips, and said unhappily, "You've become good at drinking, didn't you only ask for a jug of wine before?" Chapter 376. Lu Chen stared at the fat man and didn't speak for a long time. The expression on his face was a little strange. The fat man standing behind the counter also looked at Lu Chen. A smile appeared on the corner of his mouth as if he had let out a long breath. Then, he touched his face with a smile and said, "What's wrong? You haven't seen me for so long that you don't recognize me anymore?" This fat man was old Ma. Lu Chen couldn't be more familiar with this face. They had known each other for decades and lived together in this secluded Qingshidang village for 10 years. To put it bluntly, even if the fat old Ma was disfigured, Lu Chen would still be able to recognize him at a glance. Lu Chen shook his head and suddenly smiled. Then, he said, "You damn fat man, you're still alive?" "Pfft. I won't die even if you die." Old Ma pointed this out to Lu Chen very seriously. Then, he walked out from behind the counter and walked in front of Lu Chen. He smiled and opened his arms. He said, "But, fortunately, you're still alive." "That's good." Lu Chen sighed. There seemed to be a look of contempt or impatience on his face, but in the end, he still reached out his hands and hugged old Ma. The two men hugged each other tightly. Seemingly intentionally or unintentionally, they each patted each other's back 3 times. Then, they each took a step back and looked at each other. Suddenly, they laughed together. Lu Chen put away the black short sword in his right hand. Old Ma hid a sharp and tricky-looking spike in his sleeve. At the same time, he scolded jokingly, "Bastard, I saw that you really wanted to stab me in the stomach with the sword." I was so scared that I broke out in a cold sweat. Lu Chen spat and said disdainfully, "This kind of secret code after a long time was obviously thought up by you back then. I said it was useless, but you still wanted me to remember it. Now, you're the one making sarcastic remarks." Scram. Old Ma said bluntly, "What I'm doing is the right way. Thanks to my ideas, we were able to live a stable life for 10 years. As for those who didn't use my method, their bodies are now lying all over the streets of Immortal City." Lu Chen couldn't help but laugh. He waved his hand and said, "You're good, all right." As he spoke, he sat down at the wine table by the window just like he did many years ago. He slammed the table and laughed loudly. "Boss, give me 2 jugs of wine." As the wine entered his stomach, the slightly intoxicating warmth spread throughout his body, giving him an indescribable sense of comfort. The tavern still looked the same as when they had stayed here many years ago. Business was poor and there were not many customers. There were only the 2 of them in the huge tavern at the moment. "Why did you come back here, Old Ma?" Lu Chen took a sip of wine and asked Old Ma, "Didn't you follow me to Kunlun Mountain and then open what's the name of that shop in Kunwa City?" Lu Chen thought carefully, but before he could answer, Old Ma said lightly, "Black Hill Pavilion." "Oh, that's the name." Lu Chen said with a smile, "Kunwa City is hundreds of times better than Qingshitang village." "Why did you come back?" Old Ma seemed to be recalled by Lu Chen's words. After a moment of silence, he said, "When you publicly betrayed the Kunlun party, killed your way into Kunwa City's Sioux family, and finally fled to the ends of the world, I didn't have the mood to open that shop anymore. It just so happened that Lord Perfected Immortal had something for me to do, so I conveniently left the Kunlun party and went to Immortal City." "Immortal City?" Lu Chen suddenly frowned and asked. Old Ma nodded and said, "Yes, I went to Immortal City to secretly investigate Fuyunji. Lord Perfected Immortal suspected that there was a mole from the devil cult in Fuyunji." Lu Chen's expression changed slightly and became serious. He said, "There is a mole in Fuyunji?" Old Ma took a deep breath and said, "Yes. Do you remember that you were attacked by people from Fuyunji when you were fleeing?" Lu Chen snorted and raised his eyelids. He looked at Old Ma and said, "Someone wanted to kill me. Of course I remember it clearly. I still clearly remember that at that time, I thought that damned Baldy had completely given up on me and was preparing to send people to kill me to silence me." Old Ma shook his head and said, "That's not the case. Lord Perfected Immortal had already secretly ordered that people from Fuyunji were not allowed to oppose you, let alone chase after you. I heard these words from him with my own ears. They were absolutely not lies. However, I don't know what happened, but something unexpected happened. A portion of the Floating Cloud Division's men in the Land of Chaos started to attack you." Lu Chen looked indifferently at Old Ma and didn't say a word. Old Ma felt a bit helpless. He sighed and said, "I say, you're good at everything, but you're too suspicious. I really didn't lie to you about this, and there's no need for me to lie to you." Lu Chen said, "So you found out about this?" Old Ma hesitated for a moment and said, "It's not all my work. At least Shuang did a thorough check on her disciples. She probably found 3 or 4 people from Fuyunji. In the end, she confirmed that most of them were spies from the evil cult." Lu Chen was silent for a moment. Nowadays, the human race had been prosperous for many years. Many people had long lost interest in the rare evil cult. But in the human cultivation world, true Lord Tianlan of Zhengxianmeng and Fuyunji under his rule were the vanguard against the evil cult. But now, even Fuyunji was found to have spies from the evil cult. From this, it could be imagined that after more than 10 years of hardship, their power and strength were completely different from before. Lu Chen pondered for a moment and casually asked Old Ma, "What happened to those who were caught?" Old Ma said, "At the East Market entrance of the Immortal City, they were executed in front of many people." Lu Chen was startled for a moment. He seemed a bit surprised and said, "Killed all of them?" Old Ma nodded and said with certainty, yes, killed all of them. No one in the tavern spoke for a while. Maybe it was because they heard that the spies hidden in Fuyunji were executed in public, or maybe it was some other reason. But after a moment, Lu Chen still asked Old Ma softly, is this what the damn Baldy wanted? Old Ma was a bit hesitant. But after pondering for a moment, he still nodded slightly to Lu Chen and said, yes. Okay, let's not talk about this. Lu Chen changed the topic and a smile appeared on his face. He stretched out his hand and patted Old Ma's shoulder and said, when I returned to this village, I thought that maybe there would be great changes here, or maybe it would still be the same as before. But I didn't expect that you actually came back here. Old Ma curled his lips and said, it's nothing. I helped True Lord to do that thing, and after catching the spies, I didn't do anything else. So one day I suddenly thought that you wandered the world without any news. I didn't know where you would go. So in the end, I came back here and waited, hoping that you would come back one day. Lu Chen murmured, it's really like that. In the vast sea of people, you actually found me. Old Ma laughed heartily and casually took a rag and wiped the table a few times. He then asked Lu Chen, oh right, I heard that when you were fleeing in the chaotic lands, not to mention how miserable it was, you often didn't have anything to eat for a whole day. Lu Chen snorted and lightly replied, that's an exaggeration. Old Ma was obviously very familiar with Lu Chen. He put his hand on Lu Chen's shoulder and asked, oh right, where did you go after that? Why can't I find any news of you? Lu Chen was a bit touched in his heart. He nodded and said, if I said that I went to the southern wilderness these past few years, would you believe me? Old Ma didn't even look at Lu Chen's sincere expression and calmly said, nonsense. I'd be a pig if I believed you. You're tuning into the Carefree Valley YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.